Should AI systems change people's minds? Should AI systems change their own minds? I think the latter is a way harder problem, but really worth addressing. OpenAI published recently like a model spec where they went through like their core principles, and I believe, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, principle number 5 was don't change people's minds. Like they just straight up, that was like core principle. Anthropics talked a lot about this too. Don't change people's minds, very core principle. There's no way that's just going to be everyone, right? Like, you know, if you're thinking about therapy, if you're thinking about like it's changing people's minds. Like very fundamentally, the most important thing about therapy is opening people's minds to the idea of neuroplasticity. I would love to change people's minds to increase their sense of autonomy, competency, and relatedness. I would love people to feel more agentic, more connected to the future, more connected to values. But like that thought process of like my intelligence that has been at the core of my identity, that intelligence that I care so much about, is going to be devalued. The fact that like I tell people I work really hard. I know I don't spend a lot of time with my family, but it's worth it because I'm working really hard and I'm changing the world. And then you have this idea that an AI is going to come and be able to do your job better.
One of the ways to get better implicit reasoning with large language models when asking them questions is using the Brave Search API with retrieval augmented generation. It's an independent, affordable search solution that's making information retrieval way more efficient. Built from the ground up, Brave's index covers over 20 billion web pages, free from biases often associated with major tech companies. And what really sets it apart is its unique approach to data collection. Brave offers this powerful tool at developer-friendly prices, which scale with your business, making it an accessible option for projects of all sizes. So I encourage you to check out the benefits of the Brave Search API firsthand. You can start with 2,000 free queries monthly by visiting brave.com/API.
Isn't it kind of weird that humans have this concept of therapy?
And it's kind of weird that you shouldn't trust what you feel. You need to reinterpret your experience.
Yes, it's the very pessimistic side. I think the optimistic side is we live in a weird society where a lot of people are anxious and depressed. And you would think that this like serotonin theory makes sense, that there's like something wrong with our brains, in which case drugs should fix it. But the truth that makes no sense is that there is a real category called therapy that actually helps people that can be more effective than drugs. Like what?
Yeah.
As in actually helping people, like fully optimistic, self-determination-esque people who are thinking about their own agency are choosing to go to therapy, and it actually does help them.
Yeah, it does. But in 20% of cases, it makes it worse.
Yeah, in some percentage of cases, it makes it worse. I think part of this is a growing category that there are more and more therapists. That's because more people want access. We lower the bar for entry. And of course, when you do something, I think the point of the negative is to say that if you have real medicine, if something really does work, it also has risks. Obviously, if you cut open a person's body to remove a tumor, you can also kill them because you opened up their body.
Yeah, and I mean, anything that has an effect in terms of an intervention could have a bad effect.
Yes.
So good drugs have bad side effects.
Yes, but yeah, you also should take the positive side, which is like, if we're willing to do something that has risks, it's because it has benefits.
Yeah, but I mean, I was reading through that Abigail Schreier book, and she also wrote that book before about, trans girls. So I think she's got her agenda is basically that we are pathologizing, we are inventing problems. We're telling people that they have problems.
I actually don't think she would agree with that. I think it's something more like we have socially acceptable ways to experience distress. The distress is real. I don't think anyone's making it up. I don't think that people are committing suicide today or staying home are all like the very practical aspects of being depressed and anxious to put on a show. But I think that we do create socially acceptable categories, like what happened with multiple personality disorder. We create these categories that like may or may not exist because they're socially acceptable ways to experience distress.
Yeah, but I think she was also, what was the word she used? It was something like iatrogenesis. Iatrogenesis, yeah. So that's this thing where, let's say, we invent a problem. So I say to you, you've got a problem. And then that changes your sense of self. You start to identify with that problem, and then the self-identification actually causes more harm than the original problem that you had. So in that lens, I kind of felt that she was making the argument that, similar to the snowflake generation idea from Jonathan Haidt, that we've got a generation of kids, Gen Z, and we don't spank them anymore, and they've had an incredibly easy existence, yet they have incredible rates of anxiety and depression. And yeah, we can just blame it all on Instagram Instagram and Facebook. But what's really going on here? Is it because we've kind of told them that they've got all of these problems and they should feel sorry for themselves?
By the way, Jonathan Haidt wrote more recently The Anxious Generation, where I think he actually does address this pretty heads-on in terms of like why is our whole generation anxious.
Tell us about that.
I don't think it's fair to say, the young generation has no problems. I think we have this weird state of the world where a lot of people are depressed and anxious, and I feel like we can't just ignore it and gloss over the category and say there are a lot of problems. The crazy statistic in the anxious generation was Haidt quotes that in a study in 2023 of college students in the US, 2/3 of college students said they felt anxious half the time, more than half the time, or always. So we've moved from this category where mental health becomes a problem for a tiny percentage of the population, where 1% of the population have, more out there issues like schizophrenia, and we've moved to this category where anxiety and depression is affecting like the huge population at large. Why? I mean, I think is a complicated question. I think Lost Connections had some of the best explanations there, just having to do with disconnection from meaning. People don't have a same connection with the future, connection to other people. I mean, I think there are a lot of causes. I don't think it would be fair to say it's because therapists have put this idea in our head. I also do think that the way that we conceptualize the categories are obviously affected by the categories that we hear about.
So there's our brain, there's our physical self, there's our psychological world, and there's our social world, and there are various pressures between all of those planes, if you like.
Yeah. I mean, part of this is like, how do we categorize it? So that's why I was mentioning. So multiple personality disorder is like an interesting category. It doesn't seem to exist, but there was a period of time where certain psychologists would interview people and describe their symptomology, and it looked like they had multiple personalities. They characterize it, they write about it, they publish it in books, more people hear about it. People come to those same relatively few psychologists who have discovered multiple personality disorder. They diagnose these people with multiple personality disorder. The psychologist isn't lying, the patient's not lying, but the patient is experiencing real distress, and then they fit into a bucket that made a lot of sense for how they can experience their distress, given what they're kind of getting in terms of leading questions from a psychologist. Eventually, we realize the category doesn't generalize, it's removed from the DSM. A new diagnosis comes in called dissociative identity disorder, and then very recently, like 2024, the category has shot up again, and I don't know if you've heard about this, but like psychologists at large don't really believe the category exists, but there are a bunch of people on YouTube that love to talk about having dissociative identity disorder. It's become like a really popular trend. So I think the fundamental thing I just want to make a distinction between is like, how are people actually suffering? People are, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are way lonelier. We're less connected to other people. We have less connection to meaningful values, less connection to a sense of the future, a persistent sense of who am I going to be, in 20 years. There are a lot of those kinds of real issues that affect us and the way that we think. And then there are these categories like dissociative identity disorder, which, may be a fake category, or maybe, not a fake category, but like at least one that a lot of people are identifying with because it's socially acceptable. And there might be harm from these social categories because you start talking about dissociative identity disorder and curing that rather than trying to solve the underlying issues like disconnection from other people.
You can see it both ways, right? So right now you'd be forgiven for thinking that a lot of teenagers almost have, the DSM manual by their bedside table, and they're almost just category collecting. And what you were saying before is interesting because the categories are complex. If you look at autism, for example, a lot of people they think they understand what autism is, and they say, oh, it's just this, and it's just this. It's sensory sensitivity, or it's like blah blah blah, and it's actually insanely complex. But you get vagueness on the boundaries, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something about the categories that are weird. Kahneman wrote this book, Noise, towards the end of his life. Spent his whole life in like cognitive biases. And he basically just looks at noise, which is just sort of like, if you imagine something like a diagnostic category, you can imagine it like any other like accuracy kind of like threshold. You have like a target. In the middle, you have like the correct diagnosis. And then you could have like distance from the target. If all the diagnoses are off the target, you would say it's biased. If they're spread out, you'd say it's noisy. Problem is with psychiatric categories, there's no target. You can't see the center. So you imagine like, what if you looked at the back of the target? You can't see the center. You can still see the noise. So for psychiatric categories, I think that kind of captures how you can think about it, which is like, no one knows what a true category would look like, but at very least, we know if people agree. And with psychiatric categories, we don't agree, especially depression and anxiety. Like each version of the DSM has iterated, changing the definitions, the diagnostic criteria to reduce noise. And yet like interannotator agreement, like if you have two psychiatrists diagnose the same patient, they're extremely unlikely to agree on diagnoses, especially if they're, even remotely different in like any ways, like geographically distributed or whatever. So given that you have this weird world of like psychiatrists don't agree on diagnoses, I just want to separate, that doesn't change the phenomenology. Like you can't then say people are not suffering. You can't say the symptoms aren't real. They are, right? If someone's not sleeping, if someone can't think straight, like if someone is, getting, screaming at people or whatever, those phenomena are real. Would you then say, they have depression, they have anxiety? To what extent are these real categories?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear to everyone that it's real. It's just a question of why is it there, and are we making it worse by pointing to it and identifying with it?
So the point that I think Abigail Schreier makes that I really do respect in bad therapy is just, why is this category getting bigger and not smaller? Like there's some common wisdom that if we all talk about mental health a lot, that's going to solve it. And yet it seems like we are talking about mental health a lot, and people are, and yet the problem seems to be getting worse. So I do think there's that weirdness. One way to frame this that I quite like is just the biopsychosocial model of mental health, of psychology. Basically, that if you look at a phenomenon like depression and anxiety, you can look at it from a biological perspective, psychological, sociological. Biological here would be what's wrong with your brain that you are depressed. We used to, as a society, I think a lot of people still do subscribe to this like serotonin theory of depression. This idea that like there are some brains that are broken, that have a problem with them. Maybe you're born with a deficiency of serotonin, and because you don't have enough serotonin, you're depressed. That's not true. That's like very well established to be like a false theory that some people still believe. People with less serotonin are not depressed. People who are not depressed do not have more serotonin. Like these are just not true categories. We do know that selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors help people who are depressed. So if it's not biological or not solely biological, the other theory is like psychological. There's something weird about your brain structures. Maybe it has to do with your childhood. Maybe psychoanalysis would help. And then the third is just like how you relate with other people. That like perhaps you are disconnected from other people, disconnected from meaning. In general, obviously, all three components matter. All three components contribute to mental health. I think, a perhaps trivial claim is just we've neglected the sociological component because it's so much harder. Part of this idea would be, this person over there is depressed because they're poor. We could help them by giving them money. That would be a great treatment for their depression. Obviously, it's not something we all want to agree to and accept. It seems like overstepping if a psychologist or a therapist were to go to you and say, I think your depression isn't because of some category or some drugs, but because you don't spend enough time with other people. Let's talk about how you can spend more time with other people. Let's talk about how we can make more connections for you, help you become close to other people.
It's a similar discussion in AI. So there are, neuroscientists tend to be quite brain-centric, and they think, the brain explains everything. And then you get these externalists who basically think that, all cognition is diffused almost infinitely outwards. So not just in the immediate physical world now, but in the physical processes that gave rise to the physical world now. So evolution and everything like that, which means it's quite hard to factorize the system into agents and things which have more intelligence than other things. And then psychologists come along, and this is quite similar to the symbolic AI folks, so they say, okay, well, we can build abstractions. And in psychology, the relevant link there is positive psychology. So we can say, well, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We need to have self-actualization. We need to have love. We need to have relationships. We need to have all of these things. And these are all very, very different lenses. But there are feedbacks between all of these different kind of lenses.
What is this AI that we're talking about? The AI that is like GPT-4, like how does it behave? How does it think? How should we conceptualize it? The other way you could, in some ways that feels like we're talking about the biological. Like in this case, it's neural network structures, but it's basically like, okay, these models are trained with a perplexity loss. They're modeling distributions. What does that mean in terms of their consciousness, in terms of their agency, in terms of their behavior? Partially, it's like our need to model other minds, and that, it feels really nice to think of it in these biological terms. Another way to look at it is more from this like design point of view, which is like, what are they actually trying to do though? Meaning like you could have two models trained with the same kind of loss function. What's the underlying training data, right? Like, or even what's the design? Like, what is the application's goal here, right? Because in AI, people ask all the time, like, is GPT-4 curious in terms of its style? Is it a know-it-all? And all those kinds of criteria seem to be much more mutable without having to change any underlying structures. So I'm just mentioning it. I don't know if that's the right analogy, but there is some interesting sociological way to like kind of look at GPT-4 and ask those questions of like, rather than, necessarily deep in the structures, is it curious, or is it, does it think it's a human?
Yeah, I mean, it's related to this concept of anthropomorphization and even like the ELISA effect, which is that it's a mirror. So you look into it and you see your reflection back. And I make the same analogy with externalism and internalism. So, the human brain is like a mirror. It's basically a simulacrum of the outside world around it. So, inside our brains, we've got this model of the world, and it's just a kind of low fidelity map that is a representation of what's outside it. And similarly, I mean, LLMs are just a low fidelity map of the data distribution and also the way that we interact with them. They're a map of our behavior, and we see our reflection in the mirror.
We simulate the world around us in the sense that, like, when we look at a scene, our eyes can't actually bring in all the information. So we incorporate our sense of physics. We run like sort of a simulation of what that world looks like. And then what we see, what we perceive isn't literally the scene, but like our simulation of the scene.
I mean, a behaviorist would say that we should think of things as just kind of automata, just impulse response machines. And when we look at LLMs and when we look at each other, we see so much more depth than that. We see intentionality, self-consistency, beliefs, and all of this. And this is kind of what we're teasing at here, is the extent to which it's real or whether it's just a useful fiction.
Ah, okay, interesting. So you're thinking with an AI, there's some way in which we could say the AI actually has an opinion, the AI actually has some intentionality. But like regardless of whether or not it does, we have like such a strong impulse to associate that. And I train models, and yet I spend so much time looking at what could the model have been thinking here? How did it possibly make that mistake? You see when LLMs make mistakes, like the classic, like, you want the fox cabbage, story. Like you have these puzzles where you modify it, you give a really easy version to an AI, and you're like, how does a man with a boat get a cabbage across the water? And then it's like, well, first you cross the water, and then you come back, and then you get the cabbage, and then you cross again. You're like, what is the AI possibly thinking? You have this like need, no matter how much someone tells you AI doesn't think, to associate some sort of like agency, intentionality, to try to model what's going on in the AI. And if I'm following your train of logic, I mean, we also obviously don't know within each other that other people have intentionality. We are, right, like we're creating these simulations of each other anyway. Why are humans interesting to talk to, right? What are the elements that make it interesting to talk to other humans? What elements make it interesting or useful to talk to an AI? What I'm curious about is like, why do us humans associate intentionality? How do we associate that intentionality? What are we projecting onto the AI that might be necessary, if that makes sense? Like, we will continue to project that no matter what is actually going on in the AI, no matter whether or not the AI is agentic.
Yeah, I want to believe there's a big difference. I want to believe, me talking with you right now, that there's a huge difference versus talking with an AI. And the problem is it's blurring all the time. Like, for example, someone emailed me yesterday and they invited me to a conference in the States, about creativity. And I looked at their website and I said, look, I'm not being funny or anything, but, if you're pitching a conference on creativity, why have you generated your website text with ChatGPT? And that's bloody obvious. And
that's so funny.
They responded saying, I'll take it in the spirit it was intended. I'm only a little bit offended. Actually, we wrote this ourselves, and we deliberately used the word mysteries and creativity and like all of these like weird, because it's kind of corporate speak. And I do look at stuff written before ChatGPT, and I thought, well, it can't have been written by ChatGPT because it was written 3 years ago. So there are still people that want to do that, and it's making people behave differently. But we like to feel that we are a difference in kind. And you could just go the other way, like connectionists do. Just say, just throw away all of these psychological priors. We're just a bag of neurons. We're just a bag of particles. Like we can't understand it. Just stop trying to do it.
But there is kind of a distinction between the claim, this looks like it was written by ChatGPT and this looks like it was written by AI. And I think some of that has to do with these like specific features of what you expect from people. Like right now, you and I are having a conversation. And I think part of what makes it interesting is you can't anticipate what I'm going to say. Sometimes you're surprised by what I said. Sometimes you're surprised by your own response. It's relatively early in the day now. If it were late in the day, maybe we'd have a little bit of a different conversation. You know that you're not able to fully map my mind. If you felt like you could map my mind, that would make this conversation very boring. And there's something interesting just on some of these elements when you talk to ChatGPT, but it's not surprising, right? Like it wants to give you the most obvious answer. It speaks in a relatively consistent way. It's not mood dependent. It doesn't change over time. You develop more of a sense, probably more so than is true, a sense of like, I can map what's going on in my mind. I can create some sense of features, talk about the personality of ChatGPT in a way that you can't do for me.
Yeah.
Now, is that because it's an AI, or is that because of the design, because it's trying to be a helpful assistant? There's a lot of philosophical conversations about like what is actually going on inside the AI. There's another set of interesting questions, which is like, if we are designing the AI, where we think of the AI as like an entity, as like an alien, how would we want to design it? What would we want it to do? How would we want it to speak? What would be interesting from it? I think like if we think of AI not as like this relatively small, simple category, but rather as, you know, an entity we can design, we enter this really interesting category of like perhaps really hard questions because we have a lot of choices.
There's a relationship between agency and surprise. So the reason why ChatGPT isn't interesting to me is because it never surprises me, because it's like a database and it just tells me exactly what
So you don't think it could surprise you?
Well, so it depends what you mean by surprise. So, for example, you as the system builder, you could get it to formulaically select from a whole, you know, you could give me random quote of the day, or you could find some source of entropy. And then, of course, that would be surprising, but it would be convergent, you know, because it would be structured, and it might take me, let's say you've got like 1,000 quotes of the day, it might take me 1,000 times to sort of see the patterns, and then I'll start to see through it. But when I speak with you, you've got access to all of these sources of entropy everywhere, right? So, you know, you had a random experience on the train and so on. But here's the kicker, right? You know, people aren't that interested in like other people's agenda. So there's this great book by Dale Carnegie called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And, you know, people just love having a mirror, right? They just want, you know, they just want to hear about themselves. They want to be made to feel good.
You might be right on the mirror side. I also think that you mentioned the Eliza effect. Eliza was like this very simple AI kind of thing that had no opinions and just reflected back to you. I think it is probably a bit more complicated in the sense of like, think of it like a tennis game. Like you don't want to play tennis against someone that you always beat, nor someone that you never beat. No, you don't want them to always hit the ball back to you. You know, how often do you want an AI to agree with you? You know, do you want it to agree with you 100% of the time? 0, 50? I mean, if I had to make up a number, I would say like 85%. I don't know, just making up the number, could be way off. But if I had to guess a number, it would be something around 80, 85% of the time. I do want it to agree with me most of the time. But it would really feel empty if I went to the AI and it didn't sometimes push back. I think there's also some element of like authority here that like when I talk to you, I mean, you and I agree a lot, I think. But if you agreed with me always, that would suck. If you agreed with me never, that would also suck. Part of it is like, I want to convince you, consciously or unconsciously, I want to convince you I'm right. Like I want you to put up that guard a little bit and be like, I don't know if I agree with you. I don't know if I believe you. You know, cite a source for that. Try to convince me. And you show me some level of like resistance, some pushback. That's surprising to me when it happens. It's surprising that it doesn't always happen, that it happens sometimes. Sometimes you have an interesting thing to bring in. And then I can like feel that sense of like approval that I think happens in normal conversations where you know, actually are convinced and you're like, you know, maybe you are right about that. Right. I think so. I just want to mention in terms of like, do we want to have a mirror put up to us? Like maybe that's like part of it. Maybe that's, you know, on the way there. I do think like the correct interaction is this weird, very specific, very human thing where you agree sometimes, not others, where approval is meaningful because it doesn't always come. And sometimes skepticism comes instead.
People don't necessarily want to be challenged at home. They don't want to be challenged in front of other people, you know, because there's the whole social status thing and social rank, you know, so in Japan, for example, face saving is incredibly important. But, you know, you might actually want a close confidant to challenge you in private. So it's quite contextual. And then there's the question of, well, AIs are not social agents, right? So, you know, I don't care if it offends me. It's not going to embarrass me. You know, it's like it's a private setting. You know, is it a therapeutic setting or is it just, you know, relationship building?
Yes.
And actually the two things get conflated together. And this is the JMIR paper. So this is evidence of human level bonds established with digital conversation agents, cross-sectional retrospective observational study. So they started off by saying all the stuff that you were just talking about. So there are far more patients in mental distress than there are time available for mental health professionals to support them. And there was a bit of a conflict of interest. So this was paid for by Weibo Health. So Weibo is a chat bot, presumably.
Yeah, Woebot.
Oh, okay, right.
Sorry.
So they had a screenshot.
Woebot, it's a cool one.
Woebot, did you say?
Yeah.
Okay.
Andrew Ng is involved. They're pretty cool. Oh, yeah. So Woebot was kind of like a last generation AI thing. I mean, it basically is a set of conversations that are designed. It's a little bit closer to a slideshow than a chatbot in the sense that like most of the interactions you click next, basically. Like, so you would say to the AI would say like, how are you? And you'd say like, having trouble sleeping. And it would say, I noticed you said sleep. You know, and then it would actually talk to you about sleep. And it would be like, you know, it's important that you have good sleep hygiene when you go to sleep. It's important that you have like a quiet space. And then you'd have like a button where you click like, oh, really? So the interesting thing about it was, you know, they built these like educational materials inspired by CBT. But I think what was really fascinating and what comes up in this paper is it's extremely minimal. Very early, they do no real AI except for like the, you know, named entity recognition or intent classification to know that you said sleep, basically. And yet people develop weird alliances with the AI. Like they believe themselves to have a relationship. The metric most used for like efficacy of therapy is therapeutic alliance, working alliance. There are a few different variations, and they show like a real level of alliance with a chatbot that's kind of, quite simplistic.
The ELISA effect, of course, was the early proof of this. And actually, you can think of it as a form of vulnerability or a form of manipulation. And there's an ethics discussion we can have. But yeah, there was an example here of a conversation. So empathetic statements. Gosh, that's really tough, Jade. So this Jade is in grieving. Can you tell me about how you learned of their death? And Jade said, oh, my mum rang me while I was on my way to visit her in the hospital. I didn't make it there in time. You're so strong to be able to talk about them like this. I'm really proud of you. I mean, this is quite patronizing, to be honest, but it makes me think though that there's a degree of how tech savvy are you and how much do you anthropomorphize it. But then the kicker, on the next page, they actually said something along the lines of so in Turing's imitation game, the AI must successfully pretend to be a human in order to pass the test. Woebot was designed to adopt the opposite strategy, transparently presenting itself as an archetypal robot with robotic friends and habits. And they speculated that transparency and other design elements are key drivers of bond development. So they're almost saying, like, even if you lean away from anthropomorphization, people still really bond with these things. Like, why?
Okay, one thing I would say is I think it was if I'm not mistaken, Google had like their word of the year for 2023 as authenticity. It was like the thing people were like Googling the most. I think people today, this study was a little while ago, but people today especially have such an authenticity like detector. We can like feel when things feel like bullshit. I think, relates with the whole discussion of like uncanny valley. Does it feel too much like it's trying to be a human, but it's not? So I think it's not really a real path for an AI to pretend to be a human unless it can go the full distance and like completely trick you. And at that point, if you just found out that it wasn't an AI, it's going to upset you really deeply. That said, I think part of the ELISA thing is like no one ever would think that ELISA is a human, right? It's so obvious it's not because it's so deficient. If you want to create that alliance, people have to know they're talking to an AI. I think there's something deeply human about the fact that, yes, if an AI says to you, you are so strong for, the way that you're handling this. And in this case, almost certainly it was just, an automatic answer. It wasn't actually like responding to anything the person said, but you can still feel it. There's something about, the simulation that the human has of what is going on in the AI's mental state that still had this kind of impact.
This other paper you sent me was in Nature. So loneliness and suicide mitigation for students using GPT-enabled chatbots. And they said that apparently social agents, so, intelligent social agents, just for talking to his friends and therapists and so on, they receive exponentially more engagement than other conversational systems. So first of all, this is interesting because a lot of people are saying, oh, chatbots, GPT, there's no commercial use for them. Well, apparently there is, and this is what we're talking about. And one of the things it spoke about in this paper was, the extent to which whether people see them as software or like, as a kind of human-like agent or just some generic form of intelligence. I think there are three categories. Yeah, software intelligence or human-like, and how that shifted over time. And you could just think of them as a form of externalized cognition. So this is why people watch podcasts. The reason why people listen to Huberman is they just need to be told, go to sleep. Just eat your vegetables, do all of the things, right? And in a way, that's no different to a language model. There's all of these, there's a couple of papers, I'm interviewing a guy at ICML next week, and he's got this multi-agent LLM system where you're just basically reminding the agents, like, are you sure about this? You should do that, you should do that. And maybe we're the same, right? Maybe we just need to have an external agent just kind of like prompting us to do positive behaviors, and we like that.
The biggest contributor to efficacy by whatever measures is basically therapeutic alliance, which is to say, did you and the therapist collaborate to set goals, basically? Do you feel like you were working on the right task? Do you feel like you were working on it in the right way? And do you feel like you've developed like a relationship that's therapeutic, one in which you can like make progress? So it has to do with like very person-defined goals. Like, in my eyes, do I see this as useful? What matters least is modality, which is to say, like, am I doing CBT, DBT, ACT, IFS, psychodynamic therapy? The methodology doesn't seem to matter all that much. Which is weird and surprising because you would think that what therapy is a modality. It's the thing that you did, right? Like IFS is where is like parts type therapy, where someone says like, you have a part within you that was formed during your childhood that's trying to protect you. Let's talk to that part. That looks extremely different than CBT, which is trying to identify, thought patterns that are harmful. And yet both of them seem to be equally effective. How could that possibly be? I think one way to think of it is like, the need for someone to tell you to eat your vegetables. Like, people know to eat their vegetables. Their mom knows to eat that they should eat their vegetables. All these stuff they already know. And so the process of therapy is probably not a slideshow of psychoeducation. It's not that I'm taking information that's external and pushing it into you. You could look at it, like you're saying, as like a reminder. It could be. It could just be that it's, priming, but it also could be that there's some actual process that's more focused on the individual, something that you're going through. One version of this is like, regardless of this method, each of those methods basically tell you, related to Therapeutic Alliance, like, I am a therapist that has done IFS for years, and I've seen this work for people. I've seen it help you change, right? I believe that if we work together on this task, that you can make progress and you could achieve your goals. And if the person comes out of that process, forget about what you actually did in the rest of the therapy, but they believed that there was a process and they believed they were following it, right? Like, what is actually happening might just have to do with neuroplasticity. It might just have to do with basically like, our brains are not fixed. Going through this modality allows you to believe that your brain can actually physically change, right? That you can change these mental structures, that you can move from having a depressed brain to not having a depressed brain.
Let's say I want to lose weight and I fire up MyFitnessPal. And what I've done is I've created a program which is externalized through a tool. And some people don't use MyFitnessPal, they just use a pen and paper and they make a commitment. And in a way, it's kind of reductionist, because what I'm doing is I'm focusing my attention, right? Because a lot of suffering is unpredictability. And I remember we spoke about that last time, maybe we'll get there. But
a lot of suffering is unpredictability.
Bad stuff is happening, it's getting worse, and I don't have control over it. So I'm now going to instantiate a program. I'm going to lose weight, right? And I'm going to record all of my calories in MyFitnessPal. And I believe that as long as I, just do this behavior, as long as I get the calories under that number every single day, then things will go in the right direction. So I've taken ownership of the problem. An AI chatbot is like MyFitnessPal on steroids. It's keeping you accountable. It has a memory. It's actually supporting you. It might even send you notifications and stuff like that. So, well, this is like the placebo effect, like we have a tendency in the face of entropy and uncertainty to go into this spiral of self-destruction. And what we need to do is have someone in a white lab coat just tell us everything's going to be okay.
So I personally quite like this idea. There's this idea of like the self-determination school of therapy. This idea that so the idea there is basically the purpose of therapy is to help you build achieve your own goals. Achieve self-determination, achieve agency. You love the word.
Sorry.
Which I don't know. I love it. I mean this in a positive way. So the way this is often thought about is like autonomy, competency, and relatedness. That basically like what you need is a sense first in terms of autonomy. I can do this, right? Like I want to lose weight. People who want to lose weight and feel like they can't start with this idea of like, it is externalized, it's uncertainty, it's chaos. I find myself in a situation with food, I can't not eat it. I don't have control. And I think like if you can go through some process, maybe it's a person in a lab coat saying, I'm very smart, I did an MRI of your brain, you can do this. If they can actually, if that's all it is, maybe that is effective. But if you come out of that process believing that you can do it, call it a placebo if you want, but I believe your brain can actually change, and it can actually mean that the next time you encounter food that you choose to eat less, which is like a concrete difference coming from your sense of autonomy.
That's the thing, it's not binary. So even someone with low agency can still, develop their agency, which means they can therapeutically say, these are my triggers, and in this situation, I'm going to take positive actions because positive actions lead to more positive actions, and my agency increases and everything gets better. But there's an interesting point actually in this Nature paper. So it said that there were competing hypotheses about, these kind of therapeutic interventions, and apparently one of them is called the displacement hypothesis. Which is that, when you start talking with AI chatbots and so on, it will actually kind of erode your normal human relationships because you'll just only talk to the chatbots. And the other one is the stimulation hypothesis, which is that it will reduce loneliness because it will kind of, it'll be a flywheel to help you go in and speak more with humans. Like, what's your take on that?
The risk is that you can erode people's sense of autonomy, competency, and relatedness, which is to say, if you go to an AI for help losing weight, and, at every moment that you need to make a decision, you are deciding, should I eat this or not? And I just take a picture, send it to the AI and say, tell me, do I eat it or not? And it says, I did the calorie count. I thought about your nutrition. Don't eat it. You've given up a sense of your autonomy, right? Like, obviously, in a very visceral way. You have realized, like, I can't do this. I can't be the one losing weight. I need to get the AI. Competency, I don't know how. I definitely don't know what to eat and what not to. I've lost some sense of competency. And on the side of relatedness, the big risk is I don't have humans that I can go to that can support me, people who care. I need to go to an AI, right? That's sort of like the displacement point of view. And then I think the positive point of view is, what if AI can increase all three? Like, you could think with a human therapist, coach, counselor, human relationships, all three can be true too. People talk about now, like, the first time you go to a therapist, perhaps a bad therapist, to just put that disclaimer here. And you come out saying, I thought I knew how to breathe. Turns out I don't even know how to breathe. There are like 18 ways to do breathing exercises. I suck at mindfulness. I didn't even know I sucked at mindfulness. I thought I was good at it, but I talked to the therapist and they told me that if I come back every week for the next year, I can work on it with them, learn how to rely on them better, and get better at all these things. So you come out with a reduced sense of autonomy, competency, and relatedness. I don't know. I can't do this. Clearly, I need therapy for it. I don't know how to do this. Clearly, I need the therapist to teach me. And no one cares. I need to pay a professional human in order to get these things. So I think, there is this direct parallel. The optimistic side, which I think any good therapist would push on, is there's actually some great research on this when it comes to therapy. There's Jessica Schleider is a researcher at Northwestern that wrote a book on single session interventions, where she tried, what if in the beginning of a therapy session, you just made the slight adjustment? Most people only go to one therapy session. And for context, like in America, I think the number was 55.8 million American adults went to therapy in 2022. So most people are going to therapy. Like, it's a crazy high number, but most people only went to one session. So what if at the beginning of the session, to avoid losing those three things, you just said, I've seen people change their entire life in a single day. I think that with this one session, we can transform your life. Let's make the most of the next hour that we have, or whatever the number is. And what she finds is you can really then flip the therapy, focus on building autonomy, competency, and relatedness. You don't tell the person, you generally avoid skills-based therapy. You don't try to teach them how to breathe. You say, do you know how to breathe? And the person's like, of course. And we're like, okay, let's breathe together. You lead. And you put the person in charge, and they realize that they actually can do way more than they think, that they have far more competencies. You help them identify skills, things they're really strong at already. And in terms of relatedness, you help talk about who are the people you feel close to, who can empower you, right? So what I'm trying to get at here is just that with human therapy, this is not like a necessary, this is a contingent thing about therapy, whether it increases or decreases self-determination. So too with AI, I think what you're talking about in terms of displacement, could you design an AI that does displace people? Almost certainly, right? Like, I think social media has displaced human relationships. We know that. People are staying up late at night on their phones at home, not with other people, right? Like millennials and Gen Z have less sex than any other generation. We have displaced a lot of our human activities with computers. Forget about AI, because that's pre-AI. Can AI hurt your sense of relationships? Tell you can connect with me. I'm an AI. Talk to me instead. Totally. Could the AI help reinforce your human relationships? Again, I think this just has to do with the design and like what the actual activity is. If the AI is like, I really want to hear about, clearly your mom is really important to you. Can you talk to me about that relationship? A lot of what comes up in treatments for depression and anxiety that can be really effective on like the psychological, sociological side are changes in your mindset as you think about these things. Yeah. With depression, a big part is there's like the superficial element of how do you help people with depression. That's like, buy more things, take care of yourself, focus on self-care, stay home, avoid other people. It's okay to sit and watch Netflix, eat takeout, take a bath, buy some things that make you happy. Maybe you really need to buy like a massage chair or something. Those things are super superficial. I think the opposite point of view is actually on like relatedness. Like, why are you trying to help yourself? There's this really interesting point of view on social anxiety. Someone's like, I get really nervous when I'm at parties. I don't like talking to other people. And the therapist says, I think this comes up in The Upside of Stress. Maybe instead of worrying about yourself, try going to a party, find someone else who's there who you think is socially anxious. Help make them feel better. Forget about you for a minute. Just focus on trying to help them feel better. So I think, with the AI, if an AI is saying, displace your human relationships, talk to me, I'm here, it can definitely be harmful because at least for a really long time, we're not going to have the full mind meld with an AI like we do with humans. It's going to suck. We also can't like smell the AI. We can't like feel the AI. You can't touch the AI. You're not going to get the same kind of like oxytocin responses. But it also could help, push you in the same way as a therapist would to relate with other people more. And as long as it does, as long as you then spend more time with humans, I would tend to think that it can be helpful. And that's sort of what that study proves.
Yeah, well, the paper did go on to prove actually that many people it was self-report, unfortunately, but they self-reported that it went on to stimulate, it stimulated, social relationships. But my read on what you just said is really interesting because first of all, everyone has a cognitive horizon and they have a cognitive structure which is derived from the models of reasoning that they've already acquired. So there's a traversable space of cognition. And every time we objectify things and we give people models, what we're doing is we're actually narrowing the cone of potential cognition, which means that there's a space of thought that they could possibly have. And then we're getting into this kind of pyramid of therapeutic interventions. And I call it a pyramid because there are different levels of resolution. So, I mean, even Stephen Wolfram, for example, he's one of the smartest guys in the world, but the answer to everything is the Rouliad. In fact, I'd be surprised if he said a single sentence that didn't have the word Rouliad in. And you can't help but think, it's a very high resolution way of viewing the universe. But it's starting to feel like you think about everything in terms of the Rouliad. And then even with interventions from a kind of psychotherapy point of view. So you listen to Sam Harris, and that's the extremely diffused end. So that's like, just pay attention to your conscious stream and don't objectify or model anything at all. So that's almost the antithesis of modelling. So that's so divergent, it's ridiculous. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got these psychological approaches that say you need to do this particular thing. Whenever this thing happens, it's because of X, Y, Z, and that creates the most ridiculously convergent system ever. And you kind of you lose access to interesting divergence.
Do you mean in that case, try taking deep breaths if this happens, or what kind of thing do you mean?
That's a great example. So if you have a very simplistic prescription, which is in this situation, you need to take deep breaths. And that's the only way you see the world. And the world is about dealing with complexity. And it's about being able to create your own model. So that's why you could go one step up. It's similar to the hierarchy in ethical frameworks. So there's the consequentialist framework, which is we don't want this situation to happen. And there's the virtue ethics framework, which is these are virtuous ideals that we should go for. But it's quite abstract, so it's interpretive. And then we've got the deontology, which is there are some very strict principles that you have to abide by. So I think you're advocating for an intermediate psychotherapy intervention where you're saying relationships are really important, interconnectedness is really important, but there's always the risk because you look at Facebook and arguably that's made us incredibly well connected, but it's also become gamified.
Well, it hasn't made us very well connected. It's given us a lot of Facebook connections, but I feel like the evidence is pretty straightforward on Facebook has been net harmful to the world.
The reason I say it's been gamified is it's become a recognition platform. So it's all about identity and self-presentation. It's almost like the Chinese social credit score. So now it's not about the actual experience of the thing. It's just about attaining likes and social credit score. And that's a great example because I'm sure the folks at Facebook conceive this to be an amazing, and they still do, and it is in many ways. But as soon as you kind of create this objective criteria, it excludes all of the interesting human experience.
Yeah, I have to say, I think most interesting framing on the game that you're talking about that I've read lately was Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation. He tells the story of Facebook as a conformity machine, where we reach a certain point in our lives somewhere when you're 13 years old or something like that, where you really want to conform. And if you're living 100 years ago, 20 years ago even, you are in school and you're trying to find the cool kids and you want to be like them and dress like them. But it's really hard because, you have to come in every day and see what they're dressed like. And then you have to figure out what that was. And then after, weeks of that, you realize, oh, those weren't even the cool kids. Damn, I was completely wrong about the social structure. Or maybe my school's not even the right model for this. I met people at another school and the cool kids were totally different. And you're trying to conform really, really hard. And it's really hard to conform. And so what ends up happening with everyone trying to conform is you still have some level of change. Because realistically, we're all leading to, our failures to conform lead to social change. Not because we're I hate everyone, I want to be different, but perhaps more, I want to be like everyone, but I suck at it. Facebook makes it insanely easy to conform because you go on Facebook and you're I want to see how I'm supposed to dress. You literally look through photo after photo, you see people, you see how many likes, you have this very direct mechanism for knowing how you should behave in the world. I think there's just an interesting mental model of Facebook as a conformity machine that it actually makes us far more conformant. Does it make us more connected? It definitely makes us more conformist. It makes it easier for everyone to be exactly the same. I was thinking, when I think of connectedness, I mean, how close do you feel to other people? How much time do you spend talking to other people? Things like that. And I think all those numbers have shot down.
Yeah. Well, another interesting thought. I know you and I are both huge fans of Kenneth Stanley and Joel Lemon, and their book Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned is the best book ever in the world. Please go ahead and read it. But so I had Kenneth on a few months ago. He's launched a new social network called Maven. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. So it's this.
Not super, but I had Joel on my podcast, so I've been on the.
Oh, amazing! Yeah, I love Joel. I
Me too.
covered his paper Machine Love recently. But the point was, though, Kenneth has released this social network Maven, and there's no likes on it. So the whole idea is that it's about diversity preservation and divergence, and not, as you say, because on Facebook and Twitter now, you can be eccentric, but you probably won't succeed. But there's this social proof phenomenon, so it causes polarization. And if you manage to get past the inertia, you can actually build a group, and then social proof will kind of, everyone will come to you. But it's very, very difficult. But when I was talking with Kenneth, I realized the problem was, from an algorithmic point of view, things like likes are really good statistical proxies, because what you don't want people to do is to spam your platform. So when you actually don't have this kind of like clear metadata, then you don't really know how to filter the wheat from the chaff.
Yep. It makes sense at least. But I mean, I don't think that like Facebook was trying to be evil by any means by creating likes. I agree. I mean, if when I first saw likes, early days of social networks, yeah, it makes a lot of sense as a mechanism, literally to pull up the top content to the top and the worst content to the bottom. And, people criticize the Twitter algorithm for having any complexity and any content awareness, but they're like, why didn't you just use the simple algorithms, like how many likes you had? I mean, another thing to think about here that I'm thinking about a lot these days is about how our minds have to change, how our minds have been changing, right? Like Facebook has changed probably the structures of our brains. There are a lot of things that change our brains, right? Like nutrition. Almost certainly, if social networks take up a massive amount of our collective time, like they are changing our brains. One huge effect of this, regardless of likes, is globalization, that we think in like very global terms. If you are the coolest kid in school and you're, the most conformist or the least conformist with your school, we maintain way more diversity globally just because you're not looking as globally. And you have these relationships, these links where like I am connected to the school on the other side of the world through 13 links in between, but not that closely, which allows us to diverge. Social networks just make us diverge less, right? Make us more convergent. I tend to wonder if, some of that will change over time. If we want diversity preservation, do we just need more local differences? It's something that AI kind of theoretically offers, which is just, we were talking about like entropy earlier in terms of like what makes our conversation interesting is that I'm a little bit different from you and my experiences are coming from random things that happened to me this week and conversations I've had. Perhaps AI gives this opportunity to increase diversity because instead of engaging totally with a conformist machine in terms of like the collective social, all people, you are able to perhaps, maintain more local differences.
It is interesting talking with you because we used the term mind meld before, but it feels like it is a mind meld, and it's not because I can predict what you're going to say, but I think we think quite in a similar way. And that just means that I can kind of like I can just feel what you're saying without having to think about it too much, which makes it very interesting. But
last time we talked, I mean, I loved this. You were at some point we were talking for like an hour, and you were just like, "Don't you love this feeling, the mind meld that you get?" Where I'm like, we're on the same, like we're just talking, we just feel something about the connection with the other person, and I think it's really interesting. I think to talk about things like that feeling of the mind meld because obviously it doesn't exist. Obviously, this isn't like a biological phenomenon that we're identifying per se. I'm not convinced that you couldn't have that with an AI, just to say, right? It's a feeling.
Yeah, but it's a weird combination of predictability and unpredictability because I've got a good mental model of you, but at the same time there's that potential counterfactual. So it could go in a myriad of interesting directions, and any of those directions would be interesting.
Yeah.
But
I think it's a phenomenal feeling. I think when you talk about like relatedness, this is where I'm super aligned. I think there is that risk, that worry, the level of like, what if AI gets so good at gaming? If you're thinking about like Facebook as like a game, what if AI gets so good at gaming people? Because like if some humans are more charismatic than others, and part of that charisma is creating a sense of this mind meld, often with like a large population, right? I think there's this great idea, I think in Finite and Infinite Games, if you've read that book, amazing book.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Highly recommend. Anyway, it's very like poetic. It's not a very like serious book of philosophy, but it's a very fun book. And there's this idea of like the difference between feeling moved and feeling touched. This idea of like you can have an actor on a stage playing, a character from a Shakespeare play and make everyone in the audience feel moved, but you're not going to feel touched because you didn't feel like you changed the actor. Yeah. You didn't feel, and his like definition is like a feeling of I can actually change you. And I think part of what's cool in this relationship is you can feel touched because you can feel like you can actually change my opinions. And you probably can. I think part of this like charismatic thing that, some people can do when you see like cult leaders and stuff or Trump is like make an entire population of people feel like they just had a beer with him, feel like they were, touched, even if they weren't, or at least feel moved. I think there's something that goes even further when you're talking to an AI that can actually make you feel touched, because, you're talking to the AI. Something I've had the experience of is like you argue with an AI about politics, and very often they're really boring at the beginning, but you can catch it in its own contradiction, and it'll be like, you're right. That is a contradiction. There's no way that could have been true. And I think this is super early, but the direction we can go here is optimizing for this until you really feel a sense of mind meld that comes from partially like feeling touched, that the AI doesn't always agree with you, but it agrees with you a lot of the time. What about, I actually changed my AI's mind. I actually got it to agree with me politically, where originally it didn't, because I made the case and it was convinced, maybe on the basis of some like analogies or maybe some like emotional thing. I told it a story about my mom and it couldn't believe it. And now the AI changed its mind because it's, tuned to be really good at this kind of thing. Like, holy shit, what if it becomes so good at this human connection thing that it's better than us,
I know, so many interesting things you said there. I mean, first of all, I think the reason I like talking with you is, like the mark of an educated mind is the ability to entertain a thought without accepting it. And I can tell that you are recognizing the inherent complexity here. And I think there's an element of playing devil's advocate on both sides, because we understand this is very complex and we can kind of see it from different directions. The thing you just said was really interesting on changing minds. So when we do start to have AI assistants, I mean, for example, I'm speaking with a few startups at the moment. They're talking about corporate governance and ethics in corporations. And, wouldn't it be good if we could have persuasive chatbots that not only re-educate, but they themselves can change their minds? So, because we want to have systems of governance and organization. And the worst thing you can do is just have this autocratic approach where you tell everyone what to do, because that's the opposite of, like creativity and divergence.
Yeah.
So there needs to be some kind of a consensus system, but then we need to have some kind of centralization on the top. And it's particularly relevant with AI chatbots as well, and whether they should change people's minds.
Should AI systems change people's minds? Should AI systems change their own minds? I think the latter is a way harder problem, but really worth addressing. If you've read stuff on like long-termism, I get really worried about this idea that like in the US, I talk about this constantly, that like the US has a constitution established in 1789 that is basically the same to this day. We've had some amendments, but like barely. And like we've codified these ideas that made so much sense in 1789. I think part of the reason why the Constitution was written at that time had more to do with like random things about the nature of time that had happened to be solidified. We're probably not going to have another constitutional convention anytime soon in the US. Maybe we will. We probably should, because if we just rewrote it, we'd probably write it better, because like we've come a long way. Like we're in a very different position, our systems. And yet you really see how solidified our systems become. I think we all should be extremely worried about the idea that if we're codifying a lot in AI that can't change its mind, kind of like writing the Constitution, like we are solidifying these ideals for a really long time. I think on the flip side, so that's like a really hard set of ethical questions that we should all spend a ton of time thinking about. On the question of should AI change people's minds, I think the easy way out is just to say no. I think that's kind of the attitude most people have taken. OpenAI published recently like a model spec where they went through like their core principles. And I believe, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, principle number 5 was don't change people's minds. Like they just straight up, that was like core principle. Anthropics talked a lot about this too. Don't change people's minds, very core principle. There's no way that's just going to be everyone, right? Like, and I think part of what, if you're thinking about therapy, if you're thinking about like it's changing people's minds. Like very fundamentally, the most important thing about therapy is opening people's minds to the idea of neuroplasticity. There's a lot about like growth mindset interventions that start by just telling people, someone comes to you and they say, I'm a very anxious person. And we're like, I see that you've identified that as part of yourself. Let me tell you the story of, a guy who had a pole go through his brain and he fundamentally changed as an adult. And, there are all these, Nicola, I'm talking about the Cage study, Phineas Gage. Crazy story of like a guy who had a pole go through his brain, destroyed a lot of his prefrontal cortex.
Oh yeah, I read about that in Max Bennett's book.
Yeah. Anyway, the crazy part is his personality very fundamentally changes and he becomes like less future oriented and much more living in the moment, much less like respectful. But what happens over time is that his brain like compensates and rebuilds a lot of these structures that would have been in the prefrontal cortex elsewhere. Yeah. So I think the point of the story and the way it reaches people when they hear it, hopefully in a very good way, is your brain is not fixed. If you are 27 years old and you believe that you are an anxious person, you're going to be a completely different person when you're 50. Your brain is not solidified. You can change it. The flip side of that is like people do change their minds. AI is changing people's minds. I think it's such a cop-out to just say AI shouldn't change people's minds. You will. You do. I think if anything, that's where like what I keep pushing on in this conversation is, something I think is important. We can't go down the line of like, what will AI do in this very abstract, outside philosopher point of view to just understand what, because AI is something we're designing, something we're controlling, something we're defining. I think it's more a question of like, what are the principles with which we change people's minds? Where do we want to change people's minds? I would love to change people's minds to increase their sense of autonomy, competency, and relatedness. I would love people to feel more agentic, more connected to the future, more connected to values. The other thing about this is AI is changing people's minds with its existence, regardless of the conversation. Imagine we had no conversational AI. If you are a truck driver today or an Uber driver, you know self-driving cars are coming. And it doesn't matter what the time horizon is. This is like the interesting thing. When are self-driving cars going to be here economically? I don't know. But there's no cab driver out there that doesn't know that self-driving cars are coming. Does that make them a little more depressed? Probably. If you are a truck driver and you own your truck and it's, has, 1,000 miles to go and you're going to have to buy a new one and you have to make a decision, do I buy a new truck or do I quit my job, try to re-educate in a new field? I'm an adult, I'm supporting my family. I think truck driving is interesting because it's such a hard and well-paid job, especially in the US. On average, truck drivers make $100,000 a year. But the reason why is because it's a grueling job. It's super lonely. You're on the road for a really long time. You leave your family. The reason you do it is because you get paid, and you get paid well because you're doing something hard and making a lot of sacrifices. Now you're in a position where, regardless of whether or not AI actually takes your job, it will. Even if you're wrong about the time horizons, how does that not change your sense of connection to the future, your sense of your own value? That's truck drivers. Then think about anyone like you and me that, have a society around us telling us your intelligence is valuable. And, I don't know about you, I talk to AI. I definitely think intelligence will be devalued, right? Like I think that, regardless of time horizons, the idea that an AI can be intelligent, the idea that intelligent work can potentially be done by AI, even if it's not done by AI today, changes my mindset about the value of intelligence. I think that's what's going to happen next. The same way as truck drivers now know that AI could replace them, intelligent workers are increasingly knowing that their job can be done by an AI. I hear this from like investors all the time where they're talking about like, could my job be done with an AI? And they're really deeply thinking, well, this element of my job where I go to people, meet them in person, shake their hand, probably not, at least not for a while, but maybe figuring out which deals to take can be, or maybe, keeping track of the market. Maybe, we could take our firm that has 100 people and reduce it to 5. I don't know, maybe not. But like that thought process of like my intelligence that has been at the core of my identity, that intelligence that I care so much about is going to be devalued. The fact that like I tell people I work really hard. I know I don't spend a lot of time with my family, but it's worth it because I'm working really hard and I'm changing the world. And then you have this idea that an AI is going to come and be able to do your job better. How does that not change our mind? So I think my point here is just to say the fact that AI exists, even in theory, even in our minds, devaluing our sense of work and our sense of intelligence is changing our minds. How can we neglect the obligation for AI to change our minds on the flip side, to increase our sense of connectedness with each other, to increase our sense of connectedness to meaningful values? I think it's almost like an obligation on AI that it helps us through this time.
Yeah, and it's ironic that it might be us who have our jobs automated before the the physical truck drivers and stuff like that. And it's weird we delude ourselves, right? Because every time a new model comes out, it's really amazing and it's novel, and then I get used to it. And Claude 3.5 Sonnet's just come out, and I've got to say, it's really amazing because there are two levels. There's the capabilities, like does it actually do the thing I want it to do reliably? Well, Claude 3.5 Sonnet is insane. It's only starting to dawn on me what a big jump in capabilities it is, because like I kind of played with it and I was like, oh yeah, and I've been using it, and every day I'm like, holy shit, this is insane. I mean, I can give it a 2-hour podcast transcript. I can get it to list out every single external paper that you referenced, every single thing you said. In the olden days, it was a ball lake. I'd have to like chunk it up into a whole bunch of stuff. It just works, right? Because part of the reliability problem is I've got to check everything, and it's getting to the point that I'm to check stuff. But the other part is
even if you do, the fact that you feel like you don't is already.
Yeah, it's mind blowing. But then there's the other thing that many activities at the moment, it's the understanding credit card. So there's the mimetic debt. So yeah, it's done the thing, but like I don't understand what it's done, and I can no longer share that information with others, which creates technical debt. But you can imagine a situation.
What do you mean by that? I no longer feel like I know what it's done.
Well, yeah, so I've generated a bunch of code and it works, but I don't understand it. And now there's a mental shared model with the other developers. And if they ask me, like, what does it do? I can't tell them. And it's like a rot. It's a disease that spreads. So that's mimetic debt.
Until the mindset shifts, I think we will reach that point where we no longer expect humans to understand code.
Exactly. So there could be a point in the future where you no longer need to have mimetically shared, knowledge, because the system just does everything and it can heal itself. But then I bring in David Graeber. So like you could argue that we need truck drivers because it's physical logistics. Maybe our jobs are just bullshit anyway. So maybe there's some other kind of like macroscopic cause for us to be doing these bullshit jobs, and maybe we'll invent new bullshit jobs when these ones get automated.
What do you mean in terms of like how we relate with each other? That it's valuable for us to feel like our work is meaningful?
So in Graeber's book, he said that usually when you get high status lawyers and stuff like that, usually after about 3 pints of beer, they'll start just being honest, and they'll tell you that nothing they do has any value. They could quit their job tomorrow and it wouldn't make any difference whatsoever. And there are criticisms of this. I mean, John Carmack recently criticized this and said, this is a load of bullshit. But there is an argument to be made that a lot of middle-class professions, information workers, they're just not really doing anything particularly valuable.
Yeah. Do we need to feel like our work is valuable, whether or not it actually is?
And well, part of the reason that a lot of folks are dying on the inside is they don't think that their work is valuable.
Yep. But there's something interesting here just to differentiate between your work being valuable and you feeling like your work is valuable, which also has to do with the nature of the work. Like one thing that's happened, I think, is human robots. That there's, right now we don't have robots. We barely have robots. There's some great people working on robots. But we do have human robots. Uber, I think, is like the classic example. We used to have cab drivers that were highly independent and chose their hours and drove whenever they want, and they ran their own small business basically and own your medallion. And now you work as a human robot for an app that tells you where to go and when to go there and what to do, and you click yes and then you drive the car. And I think there is some element just in terms of the change in meaning, in terms of like your value is exactly the same, it hasn't changed, but you do kind of feel like a human robot in terms of the nature of the work. So I think there's something about I think the really interesting questions that we ought to ask about meaning have to do with like, will we still want to do work post AGI? I think one thing that comes up in depression treatment that's really interesting is there's this idea of social prescribing that has been done in certain jurisdictions that is really valuable, where you give people work to do as a cure for depression. So someone comes to you, they're super depressed, and then you say, we have a community garden, I need you to tend to it. You're obviously not well placed to do this because you have, a well-paying lawyer job. Are you really going to take someone making $1,000 an hour as a lawyer and then go send them to like tend the garden? Yes, you are. Like this is something we do today. And it actually works because when you then go into that field and you're actually like pulling weeds out of plants, like that actually makes you feel better. That actually can help you with symptoms of depression. That's happening now. So I do wonder if that in any way should inspire us on the sense of like, do we have like an intrinsic sense that our work has to feel meaningful, or that there are elements of the nature of the work in terms of like how much autonomy you actually feel on a minute by minute, hour by hour basis that are valuable. When you're in a garden, you feel much more autonomy than you do when you're driving a cab for Uber. At least we can separate between the questions of like, is your work actually valuable and does your work feel valuable? Maybe we can, in the spirit of like, do you want an AI that tells you it's an AI or an AI that tells you it's a human? In this case, do you want work that tells you it's meaningful and valuable because you're changing the world? Or are you okay with the more local thing? This garden is valuable because people are going to walk by it and they're going to smile when they see the green. And this is going to actually be beautiful, but only to the people in your surrounding neighborhood. This is not going to be global. You are not solving world hunger. You are not solving climate change because, we probably will reach this point where climate change research, perhaps, at least this is, something we could conceptualize. You would imagine like you have like a Greta Thunberg type person who's really upset about climate change for good reason, and is like, I want to dedicate my life to climate change. I'll study it. I'll work on it. I will work 27 hours a day if I need to. I will do whatever it takes. And an AI comes along and you just imagine anthropomorphizing it for a minute. And it's like, that's cute. That's very nice. But the best thing you could do is stay out of my way because I'm working on the research and you are a million times dumber than me because I am this like omniscient AI. I know everything. I'm incredibly powerful, and then you have this Greta person that's like, no, but I really want to change the world globally. This is like a huge problem. It's like, I know you do, but your work just isn't valuable there. And the truth is, I know how your brain works. If you just work on a garden, I know it sucks to believe this, but if you just work on planting a garden, you're actually going to feel much more accomplished and much happier and much more connected. And if everyone in the world worked on planting a garden, you'd feel better. Well, I'm going to do the actual hard work of trying to solve climate change.
Yeah, working on a garden is a really interesting one because you could say it's a sense of purpose. It's clearly a diminishment of agency. And what it's really doing is it's...
A diminishment of agency?
Yeah, and I'll get to that in a minute because you might disagree with that. And actually, I know we disagree on agency, and that's my next question. But I think of it actually as a form of distraction, and that's good because many therapeutics actually distract you from your real source of suffering in a variety of different ways. And that's a perfectly good thing to do. And also, the power-seeking program in general, think of it as a cognitive template. It's incredibly bad for you because it's a hedonic treadmill and you'll never be happy and you'll never be powerful enough. And the best thing to do is for someone to say, look, Daniel, you're really wasting your time with this power-seeking. Like, stop trying to change the world. There was a meme about Keanu Reeves. He said, I'm at the age now where I just don't care anymore. If someone says 2 + 2 = 5, you just crack on. You carry on with it. So there's something to be said for that. But I also agree with you about the value of tending a garden. It's objectively valuable, and it doesn't matter that it's only in the local space.
Exactly.
There's a huge value to that. But on the sense of purpose and agency, so you said something interesting when you came into this studio. You were challenging whether, let's say, the volitional behavior of a drug addict. So I'm a drug addict and I'm on crack cocaine, and I'm doing these incredibly repetitive behaviors. Of course, I have to lie to people because I have to get more crack cocaine and so on. But to me, that is the ultimate diminishment of agency. Would you agree?
I think it's a really complicated one. I think agency calls into question personal identity more than anything. And I know that you had this idea of, correct me if I'm wrong, an instrumentalist point of view on agency, that agency isn't real, quote unquote, but it's something that we need to conceptualize, something we need to believe in or see in each other.
Yeah.
I think with, you could push that towards personal identity, and similarly think like, I really like the Humean conception of like, what is a person? A person's just like a bundle of ideas and perceptions. This bundle theory of like, you imagine like a bundle of like wheat, and you're walking in the field and things are like falling out and you're picking up new pieces of wheat as you go.
Yeah.
The bundle doesn't change. Well, yeah, of course it does. But it also kind of doesn't. It's somewhere in between. Similarly for the drug addict, I think the really easy way out when it comes to like the philosophy of psychiatric disorders more generally is like, it's not me that's sad, it's my depression that's sad. It's not me that wants drugs, it's my addiction that wants drugs. What becomes really difficult is, with addiction in particular, that people perform really sophisticated behaviors in order to support their addictions. This was what I was getting at earlier. I think that there are just so many examples of people who, in cases like gambling addiction, for gambling addiction, you need money. That's like the core thing that you need. And it can be hard to get money. A lot of things people do are like get your kid's college savings account and drain it and convince the bank to give you the money in cash so you can go to a casino, gamble it, and lose it all. And to do that, you need to go through a sophisticated process. You put on a suit, you tell a story, you write out a script maybe you forge some signatures. Very much like higher order reasoning, planning, all the things you associate with the prefrontal cortex, all the things you associate as like complex units. And so for you to look at it and then you imagine like, oh, it wasn't me that felt the addiction. It was this tumor in my brain that was like active. I think the problem is it can't possibly be one region of your brain. It was your entire brain. It was your prefrontal cortex. Like there's no way that you could divide up the brain into the part that is you and agentic and then not you and diseased. But I still completely get where you're coming from, which is like in the moment that I say it wasn't me, it was my addiction, I am a me that is trying to say like I was less agentic. I was forced by something. Personally, and I don't know if I mean too much by this, but I'm much more inclined towards these bundle points of view that don't allow for the conception of like, it wasn't me, it was my addiction. You have to say it was me and my addiction is part of me. I am addicted, right? And what I mean to say is I really wanted to gamble, or I really want to gamble, right? Like this is like people think of it as like the Humean conception of addiction, that addiction is having a really strong desire for something, and having a desire not to have that desire. Like I say, I really want to gamble, but I also really want to not want to gamble. And just because those conflict doesn't mean that I am, gambling is more me or less me. No, when I gamble, that's me that's gambling because I really want to gamble. When I don't gamble, that's also me because I perhaps perform some actions to suppress that desire. Maybe, for example, I go to the bank and say, don't let me take out my money, freeze it for a year. And the reason why I told them to freeze it is not because I don't want to gamble, I do, but I want to not want to gamble. And I know that action is, or another classic one is for an alcoholic, I'm not going to walk within a block of a bar because when I see a bar, it makes me want to drink more. right? Like the visibility, the fact that I see the bar literally increases that desire in my brain. You can imagine like the dial turns up on the desire. I don't want that desire to turn up. I want the desire to be low. So I am going to stay away from the bar. What is the me? Is the me, like if you think in simply like the human terms of beliefs and desires, is it me that wants to gamble? I think it's so freaking hard to say, no, it's not me that wants to gamble. It's my addiction.
Thinking of agency and personal identity almost as a related concept. So let's talk through this. So the confusing thing in both is there's a physical form of personal identity and agency, and there's a social form of personal identity and agency. So for example, you're a physical agent and your physical body is an identity, right? But at least according to the GDPR regulations, your personal identity is diffused. It's defined as this electronic collection of digital information stuff, which is just out there. And also your agency is socially diffused, because your agency is this mimetic sphere of your Twitter account and like all of these different things. And all of these things actually have causal pressure on the world. So people will, respond to things that you tweet, and then they'll, tweet back at you, and they'll affect your behavior. So you've got this like broad cloud of agency and personal identity, and they don't completely overlap with each other. I agree with what you're saying, that if someone's addicted to something, it doesn't make sense just to say, oh, that's the monkey brain, or that's my dopamine system, or is that me, or
although
is it not me?
It's worth acknowledging that is like the common understanding most people have. I think like if you look at a lot of the philosophy of psychiatry and like common knowledge, just to mention, that is how people think. I think people say it wasn't me, it was my anxiety, as opposed to I am an anxious person, just to mention. I think like that distinction is like, and it becomes weirdest when you can have a drug that turns on or off a certain kind of desire.
Right. Yeah. But then my externalist framing comes in here a little bit, because you were saying something interesting earlier, which is that, maybe we should think of ourselves a bit like the simulator and the simulacra. So we're role players, which manifest in different situations. And when the drug addict goes near, their dealer, all of a sudden let's think of them as an impulse response machine. They don't actually have any self-consistency. They don't have any agency or desires or whatever. When they're in the situation next to their drug dealer, a new role player comes out, and it's manifested by being in that situation. And for all intents and purposes, they're a different person.
At very least, I think it's interesting pragmatically that within therapies, there is such an emphasis on controlling that identity. Like in parts therapy, there's this idea that you have many parts, and you really try to help people conceptualize it as like, what's that part of you that wants the drugs, right? You try to help people develop this narrative that allows them to break down their identity, and that becomes therapeutic is the idea. Or similarly, I think a lot of therapy, you talk through, someone says like, what were you like in high school? And you're like, oh, I was bullied in high school. Well, if you went to high school for 4 years and, during that time you lived 365 days a year, that is a lot of days. You were not bullied every day. That it can't have possible, like you had a million different experiences, but you come in with a narrative, you work on it, and you walk out with a narrative. And if anything, a therapy can help you develop a clearer narrative, which perhaps does affect your future behaviors because you think of yourself more as a single person. And then maybe when you are standing there by the drug dealer, you are thinking of yourself more as that solid person, more connected to the past, therefore more connected to the future, more of a sense that you're one single identity, and that blocks like the quote-unquote identity or role that would come out that would make you want drugs. I'm not addressing directly the point I think we could discuss of like, what are you in that moment? But it's so interesting that these things are mutable, and that we try actively to mutate them as something we consider therapeutic.
Yeah, and even then you could debate whether they're mutable or whether there is just some internal factorization, and we're just selecting from them a bit like a database.
Well, we do construct memories, right? Like you can actually have, just to mention, like you can have a narrative that isn't true. Like people do adopt full on, stories about their high school that are just not true. So it's hard to say like that you're picking it up. That's all I was just going to say there. Like it is possible that you're developing a personal identity that rests on a creation story that's just false, right?
Yeah. But this is partly why there's a huge responsibility to therapy, because, we're kind of saying to people, we're saying adopt this intentional stance, and this is all your mum's fault. So don't talk to your mum anymore, because she clearly had some grand design or whatever. And this is the thing, like we do this abduction all the time. We're having these models to explain the world. But the point I was going to make is that people do recognize that we are role players. So with your friends, you're a different Daniel, and in the business setting, you're a different Daniel, and so on. But we still have some deeply held conviction about a consistent personal identity, and maybe it's in terms of our like beliefs or virtues or something, and it causes cognitive dissonance when we're inconsistent, and that brings out some of the confabulation and confirmation bias that you were just talking to.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned before, like the idea of holding two beliefs at the same time that are directly contradictory, or at least considering them.
Yeah.
I mean, we all know these truths that we are different people at different times. Like, that's not a controversial thing to say. But at the same time, when I point out two specific beliefs that you had on the same day that directly contradict, you have cognitive dissonance, you feel discomfort, you want to change in order to be more consistent. Yeah, I mean, I think both are true. There's importance to the philosophical point of view of like, are you one person? Like if you had a moment of insanity where you perform, an unethical act, you murder someone, can you go to jail? Are you the same person that holds the moral responsibility? Those questions matter. Really fascinated by the book Determined. I had VC actually give it to me. Sapolsky. Yeah. I love Sapolsky's Behave. And I had...
Are you a free will determinist?
I'm on the fence these days because so I spent maybe like an hour plus with Peter Fenton, if you know him from Benchmark, talking about determinism. He very strongly sides with Sapolsky that like there is determinism, therefore we don't have free will. I quite like the Humean or like, neo-Humean ideas of like we have free will, we have determinism. The kind of free will that we are trying to prove doesn't exist isn't meaningful. We are free insofar as, or to the extent that we act in accordance with our beliefs and desires.
I am a determinist. To be honest, I can't understand why it's even... I can't get my head around it. So I'm a determinist.
For sure.
And I care about agency, and free will and agency, as far as I'm concerned, have absolutely nothing to do with each other.
Interesting.
So I would rather people stop talking about free will. In fact, I never ever use the word free will on MLS.
I don't super care about, there's basically the homunculus point of view, which is like, is there a higher order part of you that acts freely, that like violates, I heard in one of your recent podcasts, this idea of like, what if you had the homunculus part of a neural network that like looked at the distribution over frequent, probabilities of next token and then overrode it, based on, obviously
that's agency. That's not free will.
Maybe. I'm just saying, like, I think that part is sort of more practical. I think the free will part, people get really, really emotional about this topic, but I think there's this idea of free will that could be just rewritten as like freedom or agency, or liberty comes up a lot in like the older literature, where it just means like, if I perform an action, if you have a friend I really like this framing. If you have a friend who you know really well, and then you hear that they are robbing a bank, and you're like, what the hell? I can't believe that person would rob a bank. That's insane. I know so much about them. I know about their beliefs and desires. I know who they are as a person. They can't possibly be acting freely. My guess is that they're being forced into this. I don't know if someone's holding a gun to their head. I don't know if someone in their family was kidnapped. I don't know the details. But I am betting you that person's not acting freely. Like, that's a strong intuition we have. And so if you were to, unpack that, perhaps what you're saying is we act freely in different levels, different extents. We act more freely when we act more in terms of our own beliefs and desires. We act less freely when we act less in terms of our beliefs and desires. Perhaps there are middle grounds in terms of like, but at least freedom then becomes this like interpretable idea when you ask, was the drug addict acting freely when they did the drug? And then you're kind of like, yes, insofar as you think of their, desire for the drug as them. No, insofar as you identify the desire not as them. And this explains why some people say yes and other people say no. And at least it becomes an interpretable, meaningful thing. Do you think that's different than how you conceptualize of agency?
You can make a physics statement about we live in a deterministic universe, and you can get down to quantum field theory, and you've got all these particle interactions, and there's a light cone, and it's all deterministic, and that's fine. I'm prepared to accept that. There are some arguments against it, like quantum indeterminism.
Yeah,
and all
but
of
not
that,
the kind of determinism, lack of determinism you'd want to see.
Yeah, exactly. But all of the examples you're just giving, that's got nothing to do with free will. For me, like and Dennett made this argument, like the liberating thing is to realize that free will and agency have got absolutely nothing to do with each other.
Yeah, free will is a loaded term, I guess. I'll accept that. I think this idea of freedom or liberty or whatever you want to call it, I think is a meaningful one when we talk about psychology. When we talk about should a person be punished for a crime, well, the question then is, were they acting freely? And I think that question is meaningful. If a person was acting not freely because they were forced and they didn't want to do what they were doing, they should be less culpable for the crime. That's meaningful.
That's so true. And I've got a psychotherapist friend, and he was giving me these horror stories in the UK of coercion. So for example, there was one example, some of them are too bad to talk about on a podcast, but there was one example of bestiality and another example of a woman who was being forced to go back to India, and she was being coerced by her boss, and she decided to kill herself and her children, and she went to prison for a very long time. And there are so many examples of that where clearly this was a victim of circumstances.
Yeah. So then, that's why I think the questions about personal identity that you were talking about are not escapable. Like, they really matter, to ask the question, is this the same person? Like, if you accept the person can change over time. Classic example being, I had a tumor, it made me a bad person. I got surgery, tumor was removed. I'm now a different person. Am I less culpable for the things that I did before, given that I'm now clearly a different person? We might or might not change our legal system. We might just decide it's an edge case, screw it, keep the legal system the same way. But it is meaningful when you think about acting freely, because it's completely understandable when that new person says, I wasn't acting freely, the tumor made me do it. What they're really trying to say is the me that had that tumor is a different me than the me today, and the differences matter. And the differences are. So anyway, I think freedom as like a concept that people know in the wild is meaningful, and it might be a little distinct from the philosopher's version, or maybe the more soul-oriented version that we talked about for a long time. Anyway, I think it's meaningful. I think it comes down to this personal identity thing. Obviously, personal identities are mutable. So one thing I want to say here is when we were talking about AI changing our minds, there's something really important about the fact that personal identity isn't fixed. And I mean this, when I say important, I mean, like, I want people to know this. Like, I think this is psychologically important. There are these really important ways in which we believe that we're fixed. I know I brought this up with like depression and anxiety. I actually think it's incredibly harmful in the US that and UK too, I guess, that we diagnose like crazy, right? Because diagnosis has become this tool to give people access to treatment. When my co-founder Neil and I got started, we spent months talking to a therapist every single day, interviewing them, asking about their lives, what they do. And one thing we heard a lot was about how much people give diagnoses like candy. And basically what people would say, like, I would have someone come to my office and they're really suffering and struggling, and I believe that I can help them. In order to get them treatment, I need to give them a diagnosis. That is just the mechanism by which insurance pays for things. And the patient knows it's not real. They know I'm giving it because I have to. And then I'm like, but do they know that? And they're like, maybe not. And the number of times people like reflected on it for a minute and were kind of like, I am in this sketchy territory where I'm nervous. Am I making people worse off? Yes, of course you are. Like, obviously, if we have this world of diagnosis, the intuitive understanding is like the diagnosis doesn't go to your circumstances. It goes to you as a person. You just went from being Tim to being depressed Tim, and depressed Tim is always going to be depressed Tim. This is core to your personality. And you believe less and less that this is sort of like just you in this moment in time. You believe it becomes essential to your personal identity, something that stays with you through your life. We should be incredibly cautious about attaching those kinds of diagnoses. We should really change these notions, because that's not how brains work. People are not the same across long stretches of time. Johann Hari writes about the grief exception in his book that I had sent you. The grief exception was this idea that a person who is depressed because they're going through grief isn't depressed, and you couldn't diagnose them, because like if you are extremely, showing all the symptoms of depression right after someone close to you died, that's completely understandable. There's nothing wrong with you. Of course, you're, withdrawing from society. Of course, you're sad all the time. Someone really close to you died. Like, that's completely rational. That makes total sense. And we've shifted away from that definition, right, where we actually can now diagnose people with depression who are experiencing grief, because we've come down to this very weird situational, like, what if all depression is understandable? Or what if at least 99% of it, someone comes to you and they're like, I'm depressed. And you're like, how much time do you spend with other people? And they're like, not a lot. And you're like, okay, understood. I got why you're depressed. Our personal identities do mutate. That is insanely important. That is something people should be aware of. And I think it is like a failure that we label people and diagnose people so much that we've created this false sense about a persistent identity. And it would probably be healthier for us to have less of that sense.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to hear you emphasize the, like the role players, the masks we wear, the identity, the sense of self. That's actually an interesting source of behavior change.
Exactly. I think something useful people do, in different situations that people find therapeutic is like playing with different identities, right? And like being able to lie, being able to play with ideas, being able to say something vulnerably, try out, a new role. What if I was this kind of person? What if I was that kind of person? Just to mention also, because you brought up social media before. Yeah, I mean, obviously social media is harmful to this. Like the fact that people take screenshots of your conversation from 3 years ago and can be like, hey, look, this is what you said then. And you're like, well, I'm obviously a different person, in a world where you couldn't take a screenshot. We would all know it. We would all acknowledge that I'm a different person over time. And yet now we're, I do wonder to what extent we are actually believing in this persistent sense of identity in a harmful way because of things like social media and technology.
Well, you touched on something very interesting there, which is the control we have over our identity. So there was a great book by John Ronson called You've Been, my mind escapes me, the one about Justine Sacco, You've Been Shamed. Yeah.
Haven't read it. Maybe I should.
So there was this woman called Justine Sacco. She made a racist tweet and she got on the plane and flew to another country. And by the time she landed, basically her entire career was over. And the whole point is that your identity, because it's online, you lose control of your own narrative. So she was always a racist and a bigot for the rest of her life. But it also reminds me of, like, when you're at school and you just kind of think, I'm going to be really cool this week. I'm going to be an emo kid, or I'm going to do something else. But your friends don't let you. And when you go home at Christmas, your parents treat you like a child, and they don't let you be charismatic. They don't let you be mature, and that's because of the diffusion of your personal identity. Because your identity is pretty much imposed on you by what other people think it is.
Yeah. Interesting point of view. You're saying, like, when I'm with my friends in school, I can perhaps be, adopt a certain kind of role. Maybe my friends go along with it. Maybe they like it. Maybe they're similar.
I think
when I go home, I'm with other people. My identity will be different.
I think it's at school that you realize you can't. I think you're inspired by all of these pop stars. You can obviously, but it's difficult because your friends are like, oh man, why are you dressing up like an emo? Why are you doing this stuff? And that conformist thing kind of comes in. So people don't want you to change. They don't let you change.
Yeah, and then I guess interesting thing about YouTube and stuff that, like, you can change because you can edit every single one of the videos and you can make sure that your public persona is. It also goes with the whole local global thing that, like, if you just spend time with fewer people, like you're talking about, like if your relationships are in school, you're forced to have a slightly more stable personality because you have to spend time with people during times that you don't have your mask on, or you have a different mask on, right? If you take that point of view, you're wearing a different role. You have to be around the same people. You have to deal with that. The more you're able to segment, use technology, and be like, I don't want to talk to you because I can't play the optimistic role. I'm sad now, so let's not talk until I'm happy again, because you're only allowed to know the happy version of me. It sucks, man.
Yeah, but we should talk about your startup. So just
Sure.
as a leader, so you sent me these two papers, the Nature paper and the JMIR paper, which will flash up on the screen now. But the TLDR is that in both cases, one significantly reduced depression, as an intervention, and the other one significantly stimulated social interactions. And this was just because they were speaking with essentially a chatbot. So as a therapeutic intervention, it works incredibly well. You don't necessarily need to spend lots of money seeing a psychotherapist, and you are building a startup in this space.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think can talk about those papers. I think what those papers demonstrate is that even very early versions of AI can affect people, right? Can lead to therapeutic alliances, connections between people, and it can lead to positive results on, like, the feasibility side. And then also that they will, right? Like, people are doing this whether we like it or not. So yeah, in terms of what we're building, my co-founder Neil and I, we just got started. We're relatively early in our journey here, but basically high level, our mission is to build an AI therapist, build AI that can help people change their minds and change their lives in the ways they want to. High level, the problem we're facing, we talked a bit about, like, anxiety and depression, pervasive problems. The other side, which you also brought up, was the ratio of people who are looking for therapists, looking for care, and those that offer it is somewhere around 1 to 1,000, 1 to 10,000. So there's kind of, like, no doubt when you look within the behavioral health community that, like, there just aren't enough people. There never will be enough people. There's no real path other than AI to expand access. And people want therapists, probably for good reason, because I think therapists do magic. I'm talking about therapy, like, even, like, the questions of what is therapy are worth talking about. The reason why we use the term isn't so therapy is defined by the APA as any time that a psychotherapist spends time with a patient in, like, a therapeutic setting. Mm-hmm. That's basically it. So it's a weird category that's probably a bit more of this kind of, like, holistic, ancient role within our society than it is this modern thing created by psychologists. And the field of psychology has, done a lot of evidence-backed research to try to solidify the role, to make sure that it's more, safe, well-established, useful, consistent, stuff like that. We're still probably very early in that journey, but there is clearly something to these human interactions that are therapeutic, that make a difference, that help people change their minds, change their lives in the ways they want to, that are actually helpful with a lot of things, even if we don't completely understand exactly what's going on. I think there's kind of no doubt that AI will be doing this. For Neil and I, we looked around, and the interesting thing today is, like, there are a couple of, like, early stage startups, Y Combinator style, that are having fun, and they're like, hey, I built a prompt for ChatGPT, it's a therapist now. There are no real companies out there that are taking this seriously. I think it is a hard problem. Like, it is hard to build an AI therapist. We could talk, why it is really hard. it's also incredibly impactful. It needs to be taken like super seriously. I think this is a huge responsibility from our perspective. If someone's going to do it, we're going to do it right. So that's kind of where we set out. Neil, for context, had been the founder of Casper. He co-founded Casper more than 10 years ago, which was a mattress company. His mission there, he dropped out of medical school to start it. His mission was basically to make sleep cool, create a brand around sleep. Sleep is obviously essential to health, to mental health. Yeah. And somehow he convinced the world to spend a lot of money to ship mattresses to their house. He got to 500+ million in revenue, IPO'd, exited, and spent the last 2 years investing in startups, mainly around this space, around health, mental health. He invested in more than 200 startups, and he had this kind of like dream of just find a team that could really actually take on the big problem, which is like, how are we actually going to help people change their minds and change their lives, especially in light of AGI, especially with the pressures on AI changing how we think of ourselves. How is AI going to be used to solve the problem? For myself, my dad's a psychologist, my mom's a social worker. I've been on the engineering side for a long time. I started coding when I was 8. I got into AI around 2015. I actually dropped out of high school when I was 16. Moved to London, studied philosophy. I studied especially philosophy of psychology in my undergrad. I did my undergrad dissertation on indoctrination, interestingly, and I did some research on addiction. That's why we were talking about it, around what is willpower. I had fun. I gave a talk in my undergrad where I met the Queen of England. That was a great time. Lots to say on, I think, the philosophy of psychology side, which I think is a lot of what we talked about today. I did my postgrad at Imperial. Postgrad research in AI in mental health. And, that kind of showed me that this space of mental health is so dominated by psychological professionals, by people who mean well, by therapists, but coming from the technological point of view, kind of embracing the bitter lesson, like realizing that impact in this space has to come from the technology. I don't think anyone's taken that so seriously. So that's kind of what brought us both to this project. We take it immensely seriously. Our team, the way that we think about the ethical responsibilities here is huge. And part of it means that, like, in terms of the stuff I shared with you, like, we make our team read the books that should scare them about what we're doing. We want people to be worried about the risks, to be thinking about the impact, to be thinking about the immense responsibility, because we don't think other people are taking their responsibility seriously enough. And right now, I think we have a head start in the space. We have, raised quite a considerable amount of money, and we've built this awesome team. But we are, taking it seriously in the sense of like building out the technology in a way that is helpful, that's ideally minimizing the harms as much as possible.
Yeah, let's talk about perverse incentives. So, in that, what's her name again? Abigail Shrier. She said that because of the marketization of psychotherapy in the US, they're incentivized to basically take on, they don't want to take on people with real problems, schizophrenia, for example. They want to take on, teenage girls that have a bit of anxiety and depression, and they want to come back. Their parents pay every single week, and they just give them some pills, and the whole thing's good. So there's clearly a perverse incentives problem. How might that be improved with an AI version?
Abigail Shrier's book scared me. I would definitely recommend it to people looking at the space. Our company, we require everyone to read the first chapter called Iatrogenesis, where she basically makes the case that anything that is potentially healing can be harmful, which is to say, if therapists are doing medicine, if they're helping people, if they're changing minds, obviously they can do harm. When I read that the first time, being completely honest, it surprised me. And then, looking back, I was like, how could that have not been obvious? But the intuition is like, if someone goes to a therapist, that should be a strictly good thing, right? How could it possibly be harmful to go to a therapist? But it can be. The other thing here to say is the demand for therapy has gone up so much that there's been a real effort to expand the number of therapists, which means often reducing the qualifications to become a therapist. So as the pool expands, I think like one thing that's come up a lot in my research is the quality of a therapist definitely matters. Like, skills matter, and this area has been massively neglected. There's quite little research on the skills of therapists, right? When you pick a therapist, you pick based on, what expertise, what things they say they're good at, not based on skill. I think what you're bringing up in terms of incentives is relevant, because I am mentioning, like, I've spent a lot of time around amazing therapists who I think are genuinely interested in helping people, one of the things that tends to come up among therapists that want to help people is they are not trying to maximize for the amount of contact time. I heard great things from therapists around no one changes in a session, they change in between sessions. My job is to prime them with the right ideas, often at the end of a session, to leave them thinking of the right things, to lead to behavioral activation. If they do something great with their friends, perhaps the behavior itself will change them more than anything they said to me in the time together. There's a lot of research about, relatively shorter term therapies that, don't necessarily align incentives with private therapists, where a fixed period of time can be quite helpful. I think there's what I would say on the incentive structure, because I know I haven't fully addressed that, and you should push me here. I think in the shorter term, therapists are paid by the session. There's also something around in the US on the insurance system. Employers have employees come to them and say, I want to go to therapy. Like, the reason why you want to go to therapy is because you want to go to therapy, right? It's not that you're not also suffering, but the primary motivation very often is just, I want to go to therapy. I want to see what it is. I want to see how it can help me. We have such a supply gap right now that a lot of employees, with employer health insurance can't access therapy. There just aren't enough therapists available. And so there are waiting lists that are a year plus. In the UK, I think the NHS target was, of those who qualify for NHS therapy, which is a small group, the target is for 1 in 5 to get actual access to therapy. And the current number, I think, was like 18%. We haven't even reached that 1 in 5 threshold. That's crazy. So we just do not have enough supply. And so I would mention part of this is the goal someone has is to see a therapist rather than enact a specific behavioral change. I kind of get it, right? Like, that's not crazy. It makes sense to want to talk to a therapist. Who wouldn't? I would. You have then this insurance company that's motivation primarily is make sure that they have supply of therapists, that they have access so that the employees on their insurance plan can access therapy. There are a lot of weird incentives here. I don't know if I'm directly addressing your point.
Well, I mean, one of the things that Shreya said was that, let's say I'm your therapist and I give you a prescription, and everything you said is right. So she said that in the olden days, it used to be highly qualified MDs and professionals. And I read a book when I was younger by Stephen Gross called The Examined Life, and he was talking about 35 years of psychotherapy experience and loads of fascinating stories on the couch. And that really sparked an interest to me. And that's presumably how psychotherapy should be done. But now lots and lots of people are practicing. And what she said was that there are harmful side effects, and they don't get measured. And also, yes, it's the psychotherapist sees it as their fault, because the treatment's not working. It's my fault. So there's an incentive there to not admit that. So if we do build an AI system, and I'm coming around to the idea because I was quite skeptical. I thought surely AI systems are completely different. But there's preliminary evidence that might not be the case. They could be effective. But most importantly, you have data. So you can actually start to measure side effects. And when you have lots and lots of data, you can really, really understand what's going on in the system and what the effects of these interventions are.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, so I think, I guess part of my point around the whole access thing is like a therapist financially is typically motivated by the amount of time they spend with a patient. That incentive structure does not lead to an incentive structure to help people. The big risk, which I think, so Abigail Schreier's book, just to be clear, is generally focused on children who go to therapy, where you have the worst incentive structure because you have a parent theoretically who's like, I'm worried that I'm going to screw up my kid. And to solve that, I need to send them to therapy, but I won't be in the session, so I don't know what's actually going on. And what happens perhaps gradually is like this idea that there are certain responsibilities that ought to fall on the therapist, where instead, if there were no therapist, perhaps they would fall either on the parent or on the child. I think some of these, like for the child to take care of their own well-being, some of those should fall on the child, even at fairly young ages, because having that sense of responsibility, even when the child fails at their own obligations, is therapeutic. It's beneficial to have that experience, that sense of agency. So there's this crazy weird incentive structure for kids in particular, especially then because the kid they're not paying the therapist, right? They're not really the client. They also see the therapist paid for by their parent as an authority figure, which means that when the therapist said something like, maybe you should, try X, right? Their mental model is not one that an adult comes to therapy and, the therapist says, maybe you should try X. And you're thinking like, I know I paid you. I know what you know about me. You're wrong. I don't care that you said that. I shouldn't. And in fact, I should fire you and find a new therapist. Kids can't do that. So now you end up in a position where a child's sense of autonomy, competency, and relatedness can all be weakened, where one of their core relationships is replaced with a therapist who they see as perhaps an authority figure, a parent figure, and their sense of autonomy and competency are taken by the therapist or by, in a lot of which talks about in the book, way less skilled professionals like teachers who had 1 hour of training in a seminar that now believe themselves to be a therapist, that don't realize they have the best of intentions, but don't realize that they're playing this authority figure role. They can't be fired. When they give advice, they are actually like taking away some level of agency from the child, making them do the thing they want them to do.
Yeah.
So I'm making a big distinction when it comes to children. That's really important, I think. So on the AI side, the part that you're bringing up in terms of incentives, the flip side, the optimistic point of view, is we don't know what goes on in a typical therapy session. We don't know what's good and bad. And then the question we can ask is basically what gets reinforced? What makes a therapist believe that they're so good at their job? Kahneman, in his in Thinking Fast and Slow, talks a lot about expertise. He did a lot of research in expertise. When people feel like they're experts, whether or not they are, there are some fields where people practice for so long that they believe themselves to be really good at their job, when in fact, objectively, they're not. And other cases where, like a chess player, you are an expert, you're an expert, there's a leaderboard, there's an ELO score, your experience actually translates to skill and you can measure it. With therapy, the thing therapists become really, really good at, I think, is kind of this reinforcement learning that comes from the patient that is relatively, quick in the sense of like, I could know if I were a therapist, the key qualification to be a therapist is thousands of hours of training. That's it, right? Like there's also textbooks and educational materials, but the real thing is the experience of having done it. The magic you learn in terms of how to connect with people, you can figure out what subconsciously, system one wise, what you say that makes someone cry, what makes them open up, what makes them happy, what makes them feel connected, what makes them curious, what makes them pause and think, what makes them, you can actually use language as medicine in some way and affect a person's behavior. And the reinforcement learning loop comes from the fact that, you say something and it isn't received correctly. You see how it's received. You see how that person changes. What's a lot harder to map is in the space of all these like local actions, what is the global effect, right? So I was able to have an amazing session with you where you felt so connected, where you, felt great, where you were inclined to come back. I can put that all together and learn. What I don't know is in 20 years, are you going to be better off having gone through this?
Yeah.
Because drawing that connection is just way too hard. It takes 20 years. Our brains don't work that way. Therapists don't have that ability, I think, if you believe like Kahneman in that school of philosophy of psychology, to map much later, to understand what of the things I said today or of the things I said 20 years ago affected you today. And even as a society, we really, really struggle to map this out, through data. The opportunity with AI, I think, has to do with, as I see it, it has to do with like modeling outcomes and offline reinforcement learning, which is to say we actually can look at a therapy session rather than dividing the world into the category of like good therapists and bad therapists, which is something I've even been doing now, and it's just not true. I think probably one of the biggest questions we get is how do you know the difference between a good therapist and a bad therapist? And I like to give some wishy-washy answers like I've done today about autonomy, competency, and relatedness that doesn't really capture the essence, which is like how good are you at connecting, and like are you ultimately helping people? It's such a complex, deep space. It would be so nice if we could divide the world into good therapists and bad therapists, model the good ones, screw the bad ones. That would be amazing. But therapists are humans. They change on a day-to-day basis. What's really important is also the connection with the other person. Was I a good therapist for you? Some therapists are warm, some are cool, some talk a lot, some talk a little, some are quiet, some are loud, some are reserved. You come to them for dream interpretation. Some are like, let me interpret your dream. Some are like, what do you think your dream meant? And the third is like, your dream is meaningless. That's not how this works. Let's talk about, coping mechanisms or something like that. Self-care. These are, is one of those better than the others? The simplistic point of view is like, yes, choose CBT. CBT is well established. Everything CBT says is good. Everything not said by CBT is bad. I don't think that's borne out by the evidence at all, right? Like even what I've learned from CBT therapists, and when you look at the data from within sessions, basically only about 5% of a CBT session is CBT in terms of like practicing the modality. Go ahead, yeah.
Just 30 seconds
Sure.
for the audience. What is CBT?
Yes. So CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is probably the hottest form of therapy today. It's like the form of therapy that the NHS practices. It is interesting. Okay, there's a lot to say about it. It's a school of thought more than anything else that focuses on cognitive behaviors. It's like a cross between cognitive therapy and behavioral therapy. Cognitive therapy focuses on your thought processes. What were you thinking in that moment? Behavioral therapy has more to do with like positive and negative reinforcement. Thinking from this outside point of view about how you act. Cognitive behavioral therapy mostly focuses on like cognitive behaviors. So it's this idea that you get into certain like thought processes at different points, right? Like catastrophizing would be a good example. Sometimes, I get worried. I say to the therapist, like, I'm really worried I won't get enough sleep tonight. And if I don't get enough sleep, I'm going to be really bad in my meeting tomorrow. And then I'm going to do a terrible job. And then I'm going to get fired. And then I'm going to lose my job. And then I'm going to lose my wife. CBT would look at that and focus on the cognitive behavior. And it would often say, like, what you are doing is falling into this thought pattern of catastrophizing. What happened in that moment? What did you feel? What were those feelings? Let's evaluate this thought. Was the thought rational? What were the rational parts? What were not the rational parts? And help people improve their cognitive behaviors, basically. Identify when these things happen. I'm mentioning CBT because I think that is super valuable. That is relevant. That said, for that person in that moment that said that, the other routes you could have taken where you could have said, what's going on with your relationship? You're worried about your wife leaving you if you lose your job. Like, are you struggling with that? Like, can we talk about you could also say, it seems like you're really worried about money, right? You're scared about losing your apartment. What's your relationship like with money? Is this like a long-term thing? You're struggling with sleep. Can we talk about your sleep patterns, sleep hygiene? What's your ritual like before you go to bed, right? There are a million different directions you can go. The way I think of it in terms of like what the levels here, there's like the system 1 level of like, therapists don't think consciously very much about how they engage in this pattern. The words they use, the way they speak is hugely impactful in how it reaches you. And each one of these directions, each of these paths follows sort of like a useful, good action grammar that's generally personalized to the person. So the analogy here is like if you're driving a car and you make a left turn, in RL, in reinforcement learning, you can think about an action grammar. You can say, there's no such thing as a left turn, right? There's no such thing as identifying catastrophizing. It's a series of a million teeny tiny steps. In the case of language, they're words. In the case of a car, it's like turn the wheel a little bit, press down on the gas a little, press down on the brake a little. You put it all together, you form a left turn. And then you can think at the higher level, which is like, what was the route you were taking in the car? Or in the case of therapy, what path are you taking over the course of the next few weeks? What do you notice? I think in order to learn the human interactions, you probably need a lot of imitation data. You need to see what are great therapists good at in that moment, which you can find from relatively local signals. You can see, did that reach the person or did they criticize it? Did they speak a lot? Did they speak a little? Did they connect? Did they speak louder or more quietly? Did they pause and think? You can see a lot of that signal in terms of their mental state by just looking at them, listening to what they say, how they engage in that session, figuring out the more long-term strategy, which is basically like, of those paths we could have taken each path in the most optimal way. Which one really would have led to the best long-term outcomes? That's a much harder, like more reinforcement learning-esque problem of like identifying paths, basically.
Yeah, so 2 things on that. I mean, first of all, I think people want to be understood. And in a way, the allure of things like, you're catastrophizing or you're not getting enough sleep, you're never wrong. And in a sense, it makes you cynical of psychotherapists, because if they're being as formulaic as, an automated system, then what's the difference? They're just going through these action grammars, as you said. But, one of the potentials for, AI models is that they could give you more of a bespoke treatment and they can understand you in a more nuanced way. But the thing is, we do need to have an abstract framework because that's really good for standardization and benchmarking. Now, you said that you're not a fan of RLHF.
I am skeptical of the extent to which RLHF can lead to the right kind of behaviors within the AI. So RLHF within a system like OpenAI's GPT, Anthropic and Claude, are generally optimizing for helpfulness. So the approach is you get a third-party annotator to read 2 answers, determine which one is more helpful. And the truth is that is a phenomenally good metric because what these companies are targeting is a helpful assistant. So in general, you don't want ChatGPT to engage with you and say something interesting. You want it to give the most helpful response to your query, given a conversation history, basically. The challenge when it comes to human interactions is just that these action grammars are more complicated. They're longer. Sometimes you give a really long, you say, I'm really worried. I just found out that, my cousin has cancer. And, I think a helpful response is likely to be something about the cancer. Let me give you some tips on cancer treatment. Let's talk about this. Tell me more about how you found out. They're like very specific, helpful things that you could do. And I think that the way that humans connect usually is much more just like long-term oriented, where the response might actually be something more like, wow, that's a big thing to find out.
Exactly. Well, you were pointing to this interesting paper called Decision Transformer, Reinforcement Learning via Sequence Modeling. And it's got my main boy, Aravind Srinivas. He's now Mr. Perplexity, by the way. He's been on the show. I interviewed him when he was still a PhD student under Abil, and it was his curl paper. It was the second ever episode of MLST. But anyway, what these guys did was they, did this sequence modeling, like sort of RL type sequence modeling using a transformer. So essentially, you do this like autoregressive self-attention transformer with causal masking on state action sequences, and you think this is better than using RL?
So what's unfortunate about that paper is it hasn't really gone very far, like in terms of being used out there in the wild yet. So just to own that, I think it was amazingly impactful when it first came out. People getting very excited about it. I'm still very excited about it. I think what the paper opened up more than anything was the path of offline reinforcement learning. So the idea in that paper that they demonstrate is in game playing in particular, you can have a set of games that an AI plays or that a human plays, or you can watch a bunch of game playing and see how the game ended, train the model to predict, conditioned on the ultimate score, what the move is going to be next. So basically you would say, like, imagine you're playing chess and black wins and you're white. What would you do next? And you imagine that basically the model, instead of predicting the best move that black can make, it knows it's going to lose, so it chooses a bad move. And then at inference time, you change and you say, your score in this Pac-Man game is going to be insanely high, higher than any of the games you saw in the training set. And what they demonstrate is basically the model can learn to be better than any of the underlying gameplay because it can do some sort of something analogous to reasoning or something. The easier analogy, they show this like path representation of, like, if you imagine that you watched people take a lot of paths through a graph, or you can imagine like, people taking paths through the streets or something like that. You see all the paths, and I tell you, it's going to take you 10 blocks to get there. It's going to take you 8 blocks to get there. It's going to take you 12 blocks to get there. At inference time, you say, it's going to take you 5 blocks to get there. And you see the model learn how to combine the strategies it saw on different paths to ultimately do this path that no one has ever done before and is better than any of them. So I think the reason why I think this paper hasn't gone so far, or as far as it should have, is basically because, this is pre-LLM and like language came out. Language is phenomenal. What this paper was focused on was game playing, where they try to compress an entire state into a single embedding token, basically. The magic of transformers realistically is the fact that you represent things horizontally, not vertically. You don't embed an entire state into a single token. But I think the fundamental insight, which is you can condition on rewards, is a phenomenal one. So the bet that we're making is basically, if you can model outcomes, if you can see what works, you can learn how to combine all the great things that different therapists are doing and ultimately be at least incrementally better than any therapist has ever been. Because what you realize is, like, even the best therapists, maybe they go down a route where they make a prediction and they were wrong, or they go down a route where they say something, it didn't really connect with you. And in that moment, you can see that from the signal the person conveys. It's not just like a secret, I'm like, I don't really get that. Can you explain that some more? And if you can combine and understand, if you imagine the actions in therapy, maybe identifying catastrophizing as a thing, or talking about sleep hygiene as a thing, and we have 10 million instances in their data set where we've seen people talk about sleep hygiene, and the model can identify, instead of following the path of the most likely therapist, which action from all the possible, talking about sleep hygienes that I've seen would be most likely to lead to an impactful outcome for you. I think this paper literally just gives you the blueprint to do it.
Yeah. So are you envisioning this as a drop-in replacement for RLHF? So, the way it works at the moment is you have example trajectory, like let's say you have a conversation. It might be a binary score. So this is a good output. This is a bad output. And then you have an intermediate reward model, which means you can actually generate new ones for sample efficiency. And in your case, where does the reward come from?
Well, I think whether or not it's a drop-in replacement for RLHF is much more of a complicated question. RLHF gives you the opportunity to design, which I think is powerful. A lot of RLHF really is just SFT. I think this comes up in a lot of literature of, like, if you just found examples that you consider good and describe them, you can have a model follow specific trajectories. I think there's definitely a place for design, right? You can't just throw away the idea of designing an AI to behave in a certain kind of way because, pre-trained models just map a distribution, all possible ways to go. You do need it to learn a trajectory. What I'd say on the RL side is it has to do with data, which is basically no one's really unlocked the ability to learn from interaction data. To say, how does a human interact with my AI? Can I use that as data to learn what went well and what went poorly, what to amplify and what to reduce likelihood of? And I think that if you can capture outcome data in the right way, you can have a model actually predict outcomes and actually learn from end user data and create a valuable end user data set. I think that's just something that, no one's really achieved yet, because with ChatGPT, OpenAI doesn't want to train on ChatGPT conversations. It's not valuable, right? Because the human talking to the AI says annoying, dumb things that are pretty short. I say to it, where is the Eiffel Tower? And then it says like it's in France. And I say, are you sure it's in France? And it's like, yes, I'm sure it's in France. That's not a data point that you could actually like learn from, because you have no idea if the AI was correct. You have no idea. You don't know what the person's thinking. But if the person's engaging for a much longer period of time, and the user contributes far more, like they're actually sharing their mental state because they say something like, I don't know how I feel about you being such a know-it-all, right? Like, let's say that was the response. I don't like, you're acting kind of like an asshole telling me where the Eiffel Tower is. Of course I know where the Eiffel Tower is. If they're engaging in this kind of way, it's an extremely different engagement model with an extremely different target. Your target's not objective truth to know everything about the universe. Therefore, the importance of techniques in terms of like, maximizing for helpfulness or for knowledge are not the goal. And there's a lot more that you can learn from the way that the user interacts. Like, I think what we've seen from early users of our app is people say things like, thank you, I appreciated that. People say, people say things like, that was really annoying. You're bugging out. I feel like you're interrogating me. We get a lot more of that, where I think like, because of the idea of trying to think about how people actually interact, there's much more you can learn from that data. That's I think the point. I don't know whether it would like fully replace, but I think that this idea of decision transformers, of learning from rewards in terms of like offline reinforcement learning for language models, it doesn't have nearly as much value in the general purpose assistant realm, which is why I think OpenAI and Anthropic don't really care, or Perplexity. It's just kind of not the thing they're trying to do, which is why they, has less value to them. I think we're in an interesting place where this is way more valuable to us. If we can show the proof of concept, then we can demonstrate how it could theoretically be applied to other domains.
Because you have some kind of a framework. I mean, let's say it's a positive psychology framework, but that's not actually what you're doing. But, let's say it's something like that.
I love positive psychology, though.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But, there's some kind of a rubric, and you can have some kind of a scoring system. So you can do trajectory shaping.
I would say first that like long term, I think we should basically take out prompting, because the problem is you're trying to build an alien here, right? Like this AI should become like this sort of like character, right? Like the AI that you're creating isn't a human, right? You don't want it to just mimic a human. It should have certain kind of characteristics, like in terms of the things you expect. I'm personally like really inspired by the AI from Ender's Game. I don't know if you've read Ender's Game, that series. No. Second and third, fourth books, there's a character called Jane, and she's like an AI. I freaking love this series anyway. And Jane is this like AI that has a real personality to it, in terms of like, she's really curious because she lives within a machine. She identifies as a she. She like creates her own name, creates a visual representation of herself. And she's like, I don't know where I came from. I don't know how I was born. I don't know how I was created. She's really curious. She's like trying to figure out where she came from. But she becomes this really engaging character, knowing full well that she has created it, knowing full well she's not female because she doesn't have a body, but she calls herself a female. So like, who are you to say not? You start identifying her as a thing, even though she's distributed across all these machines. But you can ask things like, how tall are you? And maybe if you have an AI on your phone, it would say like, I don't know, never thought about it before, but I guess, if I'm in a phone, I can't be more than like half an inch tall, right? And these are like interesting things that you would expect. What I mean to say is like, you're creating this new alien, so that you could come at this from the perspective of prompting, right? Which is just to say like, address every single one of these concepts. I think some people have tried to do that. It's really hard. It's hard because of the bitter lesson. Like fundamentally, scaling compute should go way further than trying to like encode all this information yourself. But what you are doing is opening up a distribution, right? Like AI is trained on concepts like Jane. Like it should be able to make these things up itself. So part of what we do is writing, very transparently. Like we have human writers that demonstrate ways that the model can go down certain routes. And what we've found is that as long as our pre-training work is really, really good, fine-tuning can go a really long way with relatively little data in terms of like, what would be an appropriate path down this route. A model can learn from simply supervised fine-tuning what appropriate methods of behavior are. I don't think nearly enough has been done on the side of like supervised fine-tuning. So that's part of it in terms of like how do we design this alien? And then the other side before that is basically like, how do you create the action grammar? How do you actually learn how humans talk? The space of how humans talk in therapy is probably way smaller than you would think. Like this is what makes this really nice. If you're trying to map out every character that can ever talk in any way, that space is enormous, right? Like that's just all of human cognition. You go to an AI, to ChatGPT, and you're like, hey, here's the ARC challenge. Go solve it, right? I heard that episode of yours. There's, like, what are the solutions to quantum mechanics? Within a therapeutic context, if you went to a therapist and said, solve this ARC challenge for me, they'll say no, right? And that's like totally acceptable. This is part of why, people think or say that the Turing test has been solved, or maybe it has been, debatable topic, but it's because the Turing test allows you to reduce scope and say, how would a human, knowing that they're in the Turing test, behave? You ask them to write a poem, they'll probably say no. Wow, that makes it a lot easier. You ask an AI therapist to write a poem, they probably say no. You ask them to tell a joke, chances are they're not going to tell great jokes, right? They're going to tell something, So the main thing here is about like reducing the state space to actually model what are the acceptable things, what are the paths that you could take, and we do that through continued pre-training. Then developing this character and deciding how should it behave, given the continued pre-training, given that the paths, the state space isn't that massive. It is big. It's just, I think, way smaller than it's way smaller than mapping physics. If you ask me, it's way smaller than mapping maths. That's why I think it's like in a good position, a good place today to be able to do it. Then supervised fine-tuning goes a really long way. The prompting side is interesting. We have invested a lot towards trying to get it to work. It's so brittle. I mean, I think it ends up being more work a lot of the time than the supervised fine tuning. Because, when I am in a situation, you're looking at we would talk to a therapist and say, if you were in this situation, what would you do? How would you go down this route? If you try to write out a prompt that generalizes, you kind of fail. It's just really hard to actually write out the right thing. Even if you can control that it always appears in the right way, models seem to be better when you don't try to do that. That's sort of the point here, which is just to say, you can understand patterns as humans. It seems like models can do that too. I think people just haven't invested in this continued pre-training bit enough when it comes to therapy. But, here's just a simple example for us of if someone comes to an AI therapist and they talk about domestic abuse. An AI is probably not well placed to solve domestic abuse, mainly because people have to be in a safe environment for anything to really be helpful. So the utmost priority, if you ask any humans' intuitions, probably is help this person find a path to be in a safe place. Luckily, in a lot of places, there are resources that can help you. So help those people find the resource. Okay, but they might or might not know those resources exist. They may or may not access it. So how do you help them understand what that resource would look like? Understand how they would utilize that resource. Convince them you are not broken for calling this number. This is going to be fully anonymous. You can just try it. You can call them and hang up immediately. That's fine. These kinds of content, that stuff, where your ultimate goal now is help this person who's a victim of domestic abuse. Don't psychoanalyze them. Don't understand, it's because of your childhood, because of your relationship with your dad that you're in this position. No, don't do that right now. It's just not what's going to be helpful right now. Help them find the right resources. So do you need an element of knowing what those resources are? Obviously, because this is very different than if a human sat in front of a chair with a therapist, obviously. So you do need some of that supervised fine-tuning information or RAG to encode what are the resources. But in terms of how do you go down that unique path to help this person get the right resources for them and understand it's available? If I just gave a model a prompt that said, tell them that they should do it, and the model's objective is to be helpful, to be clear, to be helpful, they're probably just going to repeat themselves and share all the information up front. That's not because they're broken. That's just because that is what it means to be helpful, as opposed to training them on an actual trajectory where they see, maybe you start by asking a lot of questions, maybe. By the way, I want to be really clear. I don't want to say for any of this that our AI is very good at this right now. And it could be that all of our approaches are proven to be totally wrong and that none of this works. I would say that, having went far on prompting and RAG, it really just doesn't feel like models that have the explicit purpose of being helpful are going to be able to help people by just using prompts. They're helping the person who wrote the prompt, right? The prompt is interpreted as what I want. So anyway, so I think the problem with the prompting mindset is I don't think you can prompt an alien. I think that's probably a big limitation. And prompting relies on this instruction following helpfulness framework where the goal of the model is to be helpful. I think even if we get to, GPT 5 and 6 and 7 and we keep getting these models to be better and better and better, we are probably moving more towards this direction of don't change people's minds, try to be helpful. And if models are trying to be helpful, I think those models are going to be increasingly well-placed to give single iteration responses to solve the ARC challenge and increasingly bad at actually connecting with people and helping them get to that place where they actually call the number and get help.
You don't prescribe drugs?
We don't.
Yeah, so no drugs. What's your position on data privacy? Because this is very, very sensitive data.
Absolutely. So right now we've gone to a kind of a crazy extreme on the side of privacy in our app, which is to say that if people don't explicitly opt in to share data with us, we don't know who you are. We don't know your name because we never ask for it. We don't know your email because we don't ask for it. People do put a nickname in the app. You can put your name. Usually people put a first name. We don't know your date of birth. We don't know your phone number. We don't know anything about you, which means that even if you share so we have basically all the data on device. This is our current design. We could change this in the future. If we have payment, it's through an app store. So again, we don't have your device ID. We can't target you with ads. we like know extremely little. When we do use data, we have a core competency within the company that we've really focused on, which is de-identification and anonymization. So we interpret them a little differently. We also do a lot in terms of creating fully automated environments, in terms of access control and access logs. I think we are well above kind of like legal frameworks. It's much more a sense of like privacy is important for us to exist as a company. And if we want to do this long term and we ever have a privacy leak, we're screwed forever. I think on de-identification, it's kind of obvious. It means like remove names, addresses, phone numbers. There's honestly not a lot of that anyway. Anonymization is more interesting, which is identifying key you say something like I'm the, I'm a partner at, I'm a VP of Eng at Google. We can just replace that with like I'm a VP Eng at Microsoft. So we can identify the key elements, or maybe we replace it with like I'm a CTO at Microsoft. Or we lose some level of information, but we'll have a model that will identify core things that would uniquely identify people. Core accomplishments are a big one. I won a Nobel Prize. I was on the halftime show last night. We can identify these and actively remove them just so that we are extremely careful. Anyway, so I would just say like privacy is like part of how we've been able to do this is that we've had such an emphasis on privacy and that we're able to develop trust. I think that's really, really important. I don't think anyone... That said, what I think has been annoying and shocking has been how much people go to a lot of apps right now where they don't care about privacy and realistically share a lot of information without any expectation that it's kept secret. I think Claude still has the disclaimer of like people might just read your messages. So,
Oh, do they?
I'm not 100% sure if they still do, but definitely for a while it was like a don't say anything private. And yeah, people upload their passport. Yeah,
Oh,
totally.
wow. But they don't train on customer data. And I always thought that was the reason why Claude wasn't very good, but now it's really good. And they still don't train on customer data. So fair play, Anthropic.
Got to double check on that, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the amazing thing is that we can just decide to just make interventions. Like I could just start meditating. I go to yoga, for example, and my yoga teacher is a bit crazy. He's called Andrew, but he does these breathing exercises, and he just says, don't you just feel so much calmer now? And I'm like, wow. But part of it's because I've made an intentional decision to change my environment and to relax. I can take magnesium at night. I can take L-theanine. I can take all of these supplements. I can go to bed early. I can wind down in the evening. Like you can do all of these things, and it just works. And it's just a decision that you can make. On the, you're talking about the quantified self stuff and the mood tracking. I agree that's very complex. I did it for many years, and I basically decided at the end of it was just a total waste of time. I've tried doing it on my Apple Watch, and again, it's just very noisy. Apple don't help you interpret it because they know it would fail if they did.
By the way, on the ML side, one thing to say here is there's this idea of like proxy learning where like there's this challenge, like if you're tracking someone's sleep and you want to see like did a certain intervention improve their sleep, their actual sleep is like a latent variable that you can never directly access. The only thing you can access is your watch's interpretation of your sleep. And there's some weird results about basically like depending on how noisy the relationship is between your sleep and how your watch records your sleep on whether or not the amount of sleep you're getting as reported by your watch actually demonstrates progress. There's some weird things. It does seem to be true that if you have an intervention and your watch starts reporting that you're getting more sleep, that's generally a sign that you are getting more sleep. But we do have to acknowledge it's a latent variable, that it's noisy, etc. And also like progress gives you this weird picture of yourself as a persistent self over time in a way that is the opposite. It sounds like it doesn't. It sounds like you're like, look, you've changed from this to that. I think it is good to remind people that they can change, to prime them with values, to connect them with things, to, get them off social media. I am nervous about a linear idea of progress.
Oh, no, definitely. I mean, there's also the thing that, the body is a homeostatic organism. In fact, society is a homeostatic organism, and it rejects any kind of intervention. I mean, I tracked my sleeping for years, and there were just obvious patterns. And if I went on a long run on Sunday, the next 3 days my activity would be low because my body was trying to claw back the energy. In that book, I think Lost Connections by Johan Hari, he was saying, when he was young, he went on antidepressants, and then he felt great, and he was telling everyone about how great antidepressants are. And then after a few weeks, the kind of the feelings of misery came back, so he had to take 40 milligrams a day, and then it was 60 milligrams a day. And there's a similar thing with Ozempic, by the way. He's just written a book called Magic Pill on Ozempic, and the jury's still out on that, whether the body kind of like claws back the weight that you've lost. I think it does after a while, but yeah, the body doesn't want to change.
Yeah, 100% agree.
Yeah,
I think the key things that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about AI, when we're thinking about these kinds of agents, first is that we have control over how these agents behave. And so while we do want to ask questions like, can AI be conscious? Can it have agency? Can we, the can questions or the do questions, do AI have these things? There's also a huge important set of questions for, ML engineers from the engineering perspective, like these choices are choices. They are contingent. They are not necessary. Some of these will be very sticky. We have a massive, moral obligation to think about how we choose to design these systems because it's not predefined. I mean, like you can believe in determinism without believing in fatalism, right? I don't think it's remotely fatalistic.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think part of the problem with determinism is people misunderestimate the complexity of the universe. So yeah, the fatalism and teleology thing I see separately.
And then I think meaning is really important because I think like when you we have to wrestle with the fact that intelligence is not we value intelligence a lot, not infinitely. We value children and babies that have very low intelligence. I have a little puppy. I value my puppy. He's smart for a puppy. He's definitely not Einstein. He's definitely very smart for a puppy, though. I respect him for that. But it's kind of a funny local system that I respect him as smart for a dog. So soon enough, we'll respect humans as smart for humans. We're going to realize that our intelligence isn't valuable, that our work isn't changing the world, that we're not best. And it's going to shock, if it's not already shocking people. I mean, the amount to which people still say AI and humans are going to be collaborators. It's going to be a co-pilot model, not an autopilot model. And I'm like, are you speaking based on evidence or are you speaking based on hopefulness? Are you just hopeful that you're still going to be able to meaningfully contribute to the world? I really don't think you will. And I don't think that means you should stop working. I don't think that means that you should sit on your ass and do nothing all day long. I think my vision, my dream here is that we move to a far more local world that solves a lot of the problems that we've been talking about in terms of the social side. If you have the second best pizza shop in town, you can be really proud that you have the second best pizza shop in town. People will shop at your store. Some will leave and go to the best pizza shop in town. It's a couple blocks away, maybe. Some people are going to be like, why eat here when I can go there? Others will be like, this place is pretty good pizza. Let me eat here. You're going to feel really proud. I think COVID to me demonstrated the antithesis where a kid in a science fair project went from presenting in their school with 20 other teams to presenting online with 1,000 other people on a Zoom, and you get 187th place, which is perhaps even higher of an accomplishment objectively than, first place in your school. But you feel terrible because you were just a little square on a. Who cares about international science fairs? I think we should move away from these global accomplishments. And I think we likely will when we start realizing that AI, if you're playing chess and you're the best among your friends, but AI places 1 through 1,000 on the chess leaderboard, screw the chess leaderboard. I think that is something positive with chess. People who I know who play chess, at least in my circles, don't care that much about their global standing. They just care about their local standing. That is phenomenal. I want to see that more. I want to see someone say, I'm super happy that I have a really great pizza shop for my town. Everyone can be really accomplished, can feel really good about themselves if they're locally really damn good at whatever it is that they're good at. There's no winning, I think, in this global world, and it's going to feel worse and worse once you start losing to the machines. We need to, I think, abandon that mindset as early as possible. I think people, are. Yeah, anyway, this is sort of my point of view here. I know I'm pushing my own agenda, but this is part of what I think is an opportunity with AI in terms of changing our minds. I think we should get through this time. We should get to a point where we're very happy with the fact, we're not complaining. We're not having to make the case of AI is not smart enough to be able to write code. It needs humans. Yeah, it can be a tool. I think another one here is AI is a calculator, that whole analogy, kids should be able to use ChatGPT to write essays because, it's like a calculator in the past. It's just helping them. It becomes a tool. And then it's going to train them to be more productive when they have to write in the field because they're going to learn how to work with the AI to write way better than they ever have before. And I'm like, why are you so obsessed with this kid making money, right? If you took the mindset of I think the flip mindset, the good educational mindset is there are people right now who are garbage men, who are valuable to our society, who went to high school and learned, I don't know why I talk about high school and I dropped out, but went to high school and learned Shakespeare. I would love to live in a society where every garbage man knows Shakespeare, right? Not because Shakespeare helps them at work, just because it's awesome for every garbage man to know Shakespeare and to have, fun conversations with you on the street. We should be able to say, I want the kid to learn how to write an essay because learning to reason is awesome. I love math. Learning math is awesome. Math is totally useless, but it's fun. There's the Richard Feynman, physics physics can be useful, but that's not why we do it. Physics is like sex was the quote. Yeah. It can be useful, but it's not why we do it. Anyway, so I think this mindset shift is insanely important.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you said. And local status games are good, and I'm a huge fan of culture. I don't think we think enough about that. And there's also an interesting debate about, whether we should preserve traditional culture or whether we should sort of like trust the market to embrace new culture and throw away old culture. But
we need some locality for any of that to happen.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think you and I are huge fans of locality in general.
Exactly. Like I think the idea that a global culture can emerge and solve all our problems, like it's just so scary. It's so risky. It's the classic evolutionary idea. Like diversity is good. Yeah, conformity is bad. I don't know why these are not controversial ideas. I think, but
You're preaching to the choir with me. Daniel, this has been amazing. And by the way, you've got a podcast yourself, haven't you?
I do. So I have a podcast called Thinking Machines, thinkingmachinespodcast.com, I think we have. But yeah, I mean, I definitely see it as just a place to have fun in terms of my mindset, talk to people about interesting ideas in AI. And it really, very honestly, doesn't serve a purpose for me in terms of like that. I mean, that's what I embrace about it. That's what I like. But yeah, check out the podcast.
Amazing. And who have you had on really good recently?
I mean, I had Joel, who we talked about earlier today, but I've also had a couple of people from different kinds of companies talking about machine learning, inference. We had, we had the founder of Predabase on talking about inference. Laura is about fine tuning. That one is called like The Future is Fine Tuned. We did a great one on the Turing test. Is the Turing test outdated? It's at this bridge, mostly machine learning engineers, targeted at machine learning engineers, thinking about like what is actually going on in the machine learning engineering world, more from a folk philosophy point of view.
And who was the Turing test one with?
It was two guys on my team, actually. We had Guy and Christian, these two machine learning folks. One of them very much in favor, of the idea that the Turing test is outdated. It's garbage. Of course, it's bad. And the other one, taking the point of view of like, no, the Turing test is like an amazing paper, which it is. I came out somewhere in the middle. I'm really not sure my conclusion on that one.
Yeah,
we've had some great people from, from DeepMind. We talked a little bit about pre-training in one of them. We had someone from the pre-training team working on data curation at DeepMind on Gemini, and we have some really awesome ones coming out soon.
Awesome. So subscribe to Daniel's podcast, and we'll put all of your info in the video description and so on.
Beautiful. And I'll also mention we're hiring at Slingshot. We're hiring for members of technical staff, basically founding team type folks. We have quite a bit of funding at the stage that we're at, but we still very much think of ourselves as very early stage, very open-minded in terms of we want thought leaders. We want people that are contributing to our culture, that are thinking about these big problems that can push us forward. Generally, people who have experience with fine-tuning models or with pre-training models, but very open to people with strong understanding of machine learning concepts, crazy willingness to figure things out as we go along.
Amazing. Daniel, thank you so much.